Military and Veterans Affairs Committee. I'm Senator Tom Brewer from the 43rd Legislative District of Western Nebraska. I serve as the chair of this committee. This committee will take up bills in the order they are posted on the agenda. Our hearing today is your public part of the legislative process. This is your opportunity to express your position on proposed legislation before us today. Committee members might come and go during the hearing. This is just part of the process. They will have bills to present in other committees on occasion. I ask that you abide by the following procedures to better facilitate today's meeting. Silence or turn off all cell phones or electronic devices. Move to the reserved chairs when you're ready to testify. Could you try again? Yeah. This is why we just turn them off all the time. There, it's dead. When it's time to move to testify, if you're planning to testify, we're reserving the front row for that. So it asks you move forward. We're just going to have this so that as the testifiers come forward, you just move down, and that way we have a good head count. How many are here to testify on one of the three bills before us this morning? Okay. Thank you. So you guys can start moving forward anytime you want. Okay, the introducing senator will make his initial remarks, followed by the proponents, opponents, and those in the neutral testimony. Closing remarks will be reserved for the introducing senator. If you're planning to testify today, please pick up one of the green sign-in sheets that's on the back table. Please fill out the green sheet. Before you testify, have it ready to turn in. When you come up to testify, please print clearly. Yesterday, we had some that nobody, I don't care how good you are at reading, could make out what was on that sheet of paper. So please work with us there. That way, we're able to record accurately who was here. On that sheet, it asks for information, and one of them is phone number. We're not going to sell your number to anybody, but when the testifiers are going through the testimony, if they have a question on what you said, say you used a acronym or something, and they don't understand it, so that it goes into the record, they can call you and say, hey, can you help me to understand what this means? So please, if you fill those out, it gives us the ability to make sure that that testimony is clear and proper. If you do not wish to testify, but you want to record for the official record that you were here, there are white sheets. You can fill those out. They're back in the room, and then it will go into the official record that you were here. And it also indicates whether you're proponent, opponent, or neutral. If you have handouts, we ask that you bring 10 copies. If you don't have 10 copies, let the pages know, and we can get copies made. When you come up to testify, please speak clearly into the microphone. We're going to ask you to state your name, then spell your name, both first and last name. Again, this is simply so it's in the record correctly. We'll be using the light system today. Obviously, with the number of testifiers, we can go with the 5-minute. So green light for 4, yellow for 1. When it turns red, your time is up. And if you take it until Dick Clark's alarm goes off, you're very done. All right. No displays of support or opposition to a bill, vocal or otherwise, will be allowed. The committee members here with us today will introduce themselves, starting on my right. Senator Conrad.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Danielle Conrad from North Lincoln.
Good morning. Jane Raybould, Legislative District 28, the heart of Lincoln.
Good morning. Rita Sanders with District 45, the Bellevue Offutt community.
Ray Aguilar, District 35, Grand Island.
John Lowe, District 37, Kearney, Gibbon, and Shelton.
Steve Heller in District 33, which is Adams County, Kearney County, and Phelps County.
Megan Hunt, and I represent District 8 in the northern part of Midtown Omaha.
All right. Our committee legal counsel is Dick Clark. Committee clerk is Julie Condon. And the vice chair is Senator Sanders. Again, if you're planning to testify, right now I got one testifier, so it's going to be a quick, easy morning. Please don't be shy. Move up, and then we can make this thing hit a battle rhythm, and we'll get this over with. With that, Good morning, Senator Halloran. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Good morning, Chairman Brewer and members of the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee. Thank you for this hearing. For the record, my name is Senator Steve Halloran, STEVEHALLORAN, and I represent the 3rd Legislative District. I'm here today to introduce LB 195, Adopt the Faithful Delegate to the Federal Article 5 Convention Act, to the committee for your consideration. I will keep my remarks brief this afternoon, as I assume there will be quite a bit of testimony to follow from the second house. LB 195 was created based on the concerns raised during the legislative floor debate during the 2021-2022 biennium session on LR 14, a resolution to Congress for Convention of States to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution, as well as findings from the 2017 interim study, LR 181, which examined recommendations for procedures to be used for a convention of the states under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution by the state of Nebraska. The purpose of the faithful delegate to the Federal Article 5 Convention Act is to provide the rules and procedures necessary to create and guide a Nebraska delegation to any Article 5 convention called by Congress or a convention of states. It provides the legislature direction relating to the election of delegates and alternate delegates. If necessary, the recall of a delegate or delegates from a convention, along with the filling of vacancies caused by a recall. Additionally, it creates a structure to determine if an unauthorized vote has occurred and the penalty for knowingly casting an unauthorized vote. In closing, Nebraska currently has several convention of states calls for proposed amendments to the United States Constitution. One call for a balanced budget amendment has 28 of the 34 required states to call a convention of states. We could very well see a convention of states within the next few years. As a state, we must be prepared to act when called. LB 195 would provide the framework necessary for us to effectively participate in any convention of states. I would be happy to answer questions to the best of my ability from the committee that you may have about this bill, along with the amendment that has been passed out. AM 92 I provided to the committee, which is merely a cleanup on page 3, line 15, to strike a few unnecessary words in that line. Thank you, Chairman Brewer and members of the committee.
All right, thank you for that opening. Questions for Senator Halloran? Well, I would ask if you were going to stick around for close, but you're the next 2 bills after this, so
Do I have a
that's a safe
choice?
assumption.
I will stick around.
All right, thank you. All right, we're going to start with proponents to LB 195. Come on up. Proponents to LB 195. All right, we'll start with opponents to LB 195. He'll snag your slip there. All righty. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you. A lot quieter than yesterday, Senators.
A little quieter.
Sherry St. Clair, SHERI-STCLAIR. I'm speaking on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. The League opposes LB 195. We are concerned that there are many unresolved questions about the powers and processes of an Article 5 constitutional convention. The League has identified a number of criteria that should be met prior to calling such a convention. These include the fact that such convention must be transparent and not conducted in secret. Representation must be based on population rather than one state, one vote, and delegates should be elected rather than appointed. Voting at the Constitutional Convention must be by delegate. The Constitutional Convention must be limited to a specific topic. Only state resolutions on a single topic count when determining if a Constitutional Convention should be called. And the validity of state calls for an Article 5 Constitutional Convention must be determined by the most recent action of the state. So all these criteria for calling an Article 5 Constitutional Convention are not in place. Therefore, the League of Women Voters urges that this committee not advance LB 195.
All right, thank you. All right, questions For sure. Yes.
Thank
Conrad.
you. Thank you so much. Good morning, Chairman Brewer. Good morning.
Good morning.
Sherry, good to see you. I think we're all kind of waking up after a long couple of days, but excited to start with an invigorating topic this morning. Sherry, just to make sure I kind of have my head around the league's opposition. If memory serves, I think measures like this have been introduced in the past. Is that your
They have been
understanding?
introduced in the past, and
Okay.
this is not just a Nebraska position, this is the position
Okay.
of the League of Women Voters of the United States.
Okay, very good. And kind of, if I remember the debate from years past, and I'm guessing some of that is applicable to this year's measure that Senator Halloran's brought forward, there's fears about a runaway convention, representation, some legal, policy, and practical considerations about how this might work if adopted. Is that
That is
a
that's
fair Cliff
that's
Notes
a fair
kind of?
summary.
Okay, I appreciate it, and I'll
Real.
dig into the materials and listen to the other testifiers too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Senator Rabel.
Good morning, Sherry. Welcome back.
Thank you.
To the Government Affairs Committee. I have a question for you. I'm not up to speed on this issue at all, so I apologize for this question, but has the state of Nebraska even adopted a legislation that calls and supports for the convention? Are we one of the states that
I
has
believe
done?
that we are one of the states.
We
yes.
are, okay. All right, now this makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you for your
Thank you.
testimony. Okay, any other opponents to LB 195? Welcome to the Government Committee.
Good morning. My name is Wesley Dodge, Wesley, Dodge, D-O-D-G-E. I'm from Omaha, and I'm associated with Represent Us. And I'm here to speak in opposition to the legislation. Unlike yesterday's testimony where you had some very specific language in the Constitution where it said there shall be no hindrance or implement to the right of qualified voter to vote, an Article 5 situation is a lot more complicated because it's incredibly vague. When I got ready to come in here and testified, I looked at the legislation, the two 195 NLR 31, which are both considerably longer than Article 5 of the Constitution that deals with it. And what I would like people to look at, we have passed it. We passed it last year, and it was a little scary because it went through fast. It was introduced, and I think it came through, and it was in like a week or something like that, maybe two tops. And so I think it's important we ask why. Why do people want this passed? What are the reasons? I see Second Amendment proponents. I see balanced budget proponents. There's an organization called Wolfpack, which is a liberal organization that's funded by a guy named Cenk Uygur, who wants to undo Citizens United, and then the Mercers and the Koch brothers, prior to the one's death, were the funders. I spoke at the Free Speech Society in Omaha this last summer, and they divided my time because I was talking about ranked choice voting between myself and someone speaking on term limits. I was excited about speaking at the organization. I brought some copies of the pocket constitutions to give to people. And as I was speaking and listening to this fellow talk about term limits, it was like, there's something else going on here. And what was going on was he was involved with that organization funded by Howard Rich, trying to get an Article 5 convention adopted, but he was talking about term limits, and you barely saw it in his presentation. He mentioned Article 5 at some point. So I'm fearful of those Trojan horse kind of experiences that I've seen when this is adopted. And so to me, the big question is why. I want people to look at it and say, why is this being done? And then I think it's also a dark money issue to some degree. We've got some good bills pending right now, LB 9 and LB 737, which can deal with some of those issues. But I'm scared because this is dark money type of things happening here to try to drive a wedge in and do some things we don't want done. I don't know how much of a historian all of you are, but we've been down the the path of the Articles of Confederation. And I feel like we're going back to that when we're looking at this type of thing. It looks like this is the concept that's behind this. So that troubles me. When I read the language in 195, I think it severely neuters whoever goes. So it looks like we're supposed to do committees. It's supposed to be a legislator. I forget the numbers that you are all actually representing. I think it's about 40,000 people. So do we have one legislator that's picked by everyone else to go represent everybody in this constitutional convention? That's scary. I mean, that's not scary because any of you individually, but it's just scary to me that one person is going to represent the state of Nebraska. When they do the convention, they can blow everything up. It's just like the Second Continental Congress that brought us the Constitution. They can blow everything up. The only things that are protected is a clause that had to do with slavery, which is fortunately obsolete now, and a second one that says we'll still have equal representation in the Senate. So, and that one's somewhat debatable according to what people have said. So all of those things are problematic to me. I really want you to look at this. We have passed it. We've got the sunset clause. I even called, I forget which legislator it was that plugged in that 5 year, but I called her up and thanked her. And I said, thanks for that. I mean, it's important. And in 5 years, things might be a lot different. Michigan is now a completely Republican controlled state. Or I'm sorry, Democratic controlled state. And in 5 years or 4 years, where are we going to be? If this is indefinite, are we going to hit that 2/3 limit, in 20 years? I'll probably be gone and some of you will be a lot older. What's going to happen? So I just want you to look at it. The runaway convention is what I'm worried about. Changes will occur at that convention if it's held. The people who are there to some degree will be there because the ultra rich amongst us got this passed so that they can make the changes they want to change. I believe in equal representation and the power of the poorest of us, along with the power of the richest among us being somewhat equal. And for that reason, I'm opposed.
All right. Thank you for your testimony. Let's see if we have questions for you. Senator
Yes.
Rabel.
Wesley, thank you very much for your testimony. So to help me understand better, are there other states out there that have put guardrails on what happens in our states, but it won't affect the convention? Because you said what could happen at the convention, it could just all blow up.
I can't answer that specifically as to each state, but as you read Article 5, I mean, we still have the supremacy clause. We're still a federal form of government. So once we get there, the way I interpret Article 5, and I don't profess to be a super constitutional scholar, I think all bets are off at that point. And I don't want to use that as hyperbole, but they are going to sit down and they're going to say, what are we going to do? And like I said, this 195, I'm reading it to say that we're going to have meetings and they're going to tell the delegate exactly what you're going to do, or delegates. And if that happens, our delegates are going to go in with their hands tied. Something will blow up there at the Constitutional Convention. And it's like, well, am I obligated to what my legislature specifically told me I can do? And then I have to sit on the sidelines while something catastrophic potentially happens.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? I guess I got one for you before you go. You bounced around with names and different things. So for clarification, are you opposed to term limits?
Am I opposed to term limits? No, I forget whose bill it is. It's taken us to 3. I think that would be good to go to 3, but because I think they'd give us some more consistency in the legislature.
Okay. Are you opposed to the balanced budget?
I think the balanced budget question is a deep question. I think part of a budget is the income as well as the expenditure. If you look at what's happened with taxation since the Reagan administration, right now, the average Joe, a person like me, pays about 14 to 14.5% of my income in taxes. What's his name? The Amazon owner. Amazon doesn't pay taxes. I just saw that the 2 largest oil companies made $50 million plus. They don't pay taxes. The average oligarch, I shouldn't call them oligarch, the ultra rich, the 1%ers, they average about 3 to 4%. So my answer to that is when I have a budget in my house, I start with my income. And so I keep my budget balanced. I'm living okay on not a exceptionally high income because I spend time coming down here instead of billing time as an attorney, which I am. But if you run a budget, you got to have the income, and we've been blowing up the income and still spending the money, and that's just not smart. So the answer is yes, I support a balanced budget, but I think part of that is the income, and you got to keep the income coming in.
Well, and I think some of the thought process behind the Article 5 is if the system continues to do what it's doing, and 30 some, we're into the trillions in debt, and just in the time that some of us have been here, that's jumped 10 trillion. Do you think there's a break point where if we go far enough in debt that there'll be consequences, or do you think we can just keep running this indefinitely?
Yeah, I think there will be consequences. And I think part of the problem is we tend to have older people elected to offices, and they're focusing on what can I do now? What can I do to get to the next election and get elected? And then it's easy to spend money. And when you analyze what's happened nationally with our budget, and I've looked at this, and I wish I had one of those minds where I could pull numbers out like crazy, but I just tend to speak in generalities. But if you look at the increase in our national debt, it doesn't track with the party in power necessarily. So people make the noise when they're not in power and condemn things, and then when they are in power, they don't make that same noise that they used to make when they weren't. So I think a lot of this reaches back to my ranked choice voting concepts, but reaches back to, I think every election should in essence be a general election. If we have you concerned about everybody that votes in May, as much as you're concerned about everybody that votes in November, I think we're going to get people who can make harder choices. And if you don't have to worry about whoever's on the right or whoever's on the left and keeping them happy in May, I think you're going to be more responsible with your budget too, but you're going to be trying to do the greater good for the greater amount of people.
Well, and to your point on term limits and balanced budget, I guess we can consider ourselves somewhat blessed in Nebraska because we balance the budget every year and we have term limits. Now, whether term limits are a good thing and what the number of years are, Nebraska saw fit to put this limitation on. The more concern here is we're talking about the federal side, and there are no limits. There's no term limits. There's no budget limits. And I think some are concerned that at a point, the system can't continue. It will collapse. And if what you're saying, this geriatric ward that we have running the country,
no insult was
allow it to continue to do this, what checks do we have to make sure that it just doesn't?
We can still amend our Constitution. We just don't have to do it this way. We can talk about specifics. We can offer specific amendments about a balanced budget. We can offer specific amendments about term limits. It's there. It's the thing we've done every single other time we've amended the Constitution.
So we're going to take the geriatric ward that is enjoying term limits, and we're going to trust them to change the Constitution that would limit their powers.
No, we could pass some legislation that does what I told you about, where every election becomes a general election, and we don't don't get these entrenched people that once they're in, and the money comes in. And
when you say we can change it, who's the we in this?
I'm hoping we can make noise as a general population that we want to see those changes. Alaska's made changes recently. Hawaii just adopted changes. So you're saying
states make changes?
Sure.
Okay, but then how does that state affect the national? Because states can be pretty squared away, pretty well hitting on all cylinders, doing the right thing. Our concern is if the big central federal government won't check itself, won't manage the way it should, whether it be term limits, whether it be budget, whatever. How do you affect that? I think where folks start to look toward Article 5 and say, is this one of those options that are out there we should be looking at?
It's an option, but I think it's too dangerous.
Okay, but if we don't use that, what do we use? That's what I'm trying to get to.
What I was just discussing, I think if we do if we adjust our statewide electoral systems all the way across the board, we're going to get people who aren't, I mean, the dark money bill, if people don't get $100,000 dropped in their campaign, so somebody that wants them in power gets them in, and they're limited to $1,000, there's less power there. And yeah.
I can argue that.
Have you read the Politics Industry book? It's a really good book. And again, I wish I could come up with exact numbers, but before you get into the booth to cast your vote, they're not concerned about your vote. They're concerned about money. When I say they, I mean the elected officials. Who can I make happy so I get that $40,000 donation? I get that $40,000 dark money donation, and your vote doesn't mean that much to me until I can start flooding the airways and making this ubiquitous concept come through everybody's head that somebody's the devil that maybe isn't.
Okay.
Kouth, I live in her district. There was a dump yesterday, a term limit dump on her from some PAC out in South Carolina. Yeah. And they're trying to manipulate you guys from South Carolina. Okay. We need to clean that up. And if we clean that up, then we're going to get to the problem. We got to fix it from the ground up. We got a bad foundation. We got to fix the foundation before we remodel the living room.
Okay. Well, I guess I'm still looking at the federal side, and you're looking at the state side.
Yeah. And I have my 5 minutes, and thank you for the extra questions. I love it. Thank you. If we have a more in-depth conversation, which I'd love to, I think maybe there might be some fixes there. I can't come up with them right now sitting at this table without the resources I would like to really get to
additional
that.
Questions? Senator Connor.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Brewer. Good morning, Mr. Dodge. I don't want to put words in either of your mouths, but it sounds to me maybe like your exchange with Senator Brewer, maybe we were kind of talking past each other. I took his point to mean that there are, of course, a variety of different ways to amend our state and, of course, our federal constitution. And is the general perspective from your point of view is this is just not the way to go about it? You'd prefer that citizens utilize the other mechanisms to amend the federal constitution. Yeah. Is that a fair
it gets
assessment?
Back to the why question I asked at the beginning.
Right.
What's the purpose? Once we're in the door, what's the purpose?
Sure. Yeah. Because I appreciate there's a lot of related issues here, but it sounds like maybe there's just a difference of opinion in regards to the best strategy to utilize for amending the U.S. Constitution.
Right. Okay. I think that limitations are important, and Article 5 is very vague. If you read it, it's very vague.
Yes, I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Any additional questions? All right. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. We are still on opponents to LB 195. All right. Are there any in the neutral for LB 195? All right. We'll invite Senator Holleran back up for close.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to have the second house come in and speak. I think Mr. Dodge made my point for me. Clearly, and for those that weren't involved with the Article 5 resolution, LR 14 resolution specifically detailed 3 subject matters that the resolution, the Convention of States, would be confined to. One was fiscal restraint. People commonly refer to that as a balanced budget amendment. Second one was term limits on Congress. And the third one was limiting the scope and authority of the federal government. Now, that may seem very broad, but the 10th Amendment narrowly defines what the authority is of the federal government, very narrowly defines it, and gives all other authority to the states. Over time, we have acquiesced our state authority to the federal government. Honestly, we don't have much state authority available to us anymore. And the reason for that, the reason we acquiesced that to the federal government is that a lot of appropriations bills, let's just use highway construction for an example, one of many, many of the appropriations that come from the federal government or ARPA monies recently are very much defined by the federal government. And there's always some little caveats that are applied to it that require the state government to do this, A, or this, B, in order to get the money. And so over time, we have acquiesced to the federal government to get that money. Well, what have we done? We have acquiesced our own authority to drive and operate our own state to do that. But anyway, so those three subject matters: fiscal restraint, term limits, limiting the scope of the authority of the federal government. I'm not sure if the two testifiers that testified in opposition to this read the faithful delegate amendment, but it narrowly details that narrowly those delegates that are chosen by us, and yes, they're going to be from the legislative body. I don't know how you have an open call for delegates statewide. It would be a general election process where people would have to run for it, and campaign for it, and everything else. Would seem to be a little bit impractical, particularly if the call for convention is called and we have a limited amount of time to appoint delegates to go. So the bill does designate the delegates would be chosen from the legislature. Legislators have already been vetted by the electorate, hopefully, vetted by the electorate and elected to that position. And the faithful delegate amendment points out that if they go beyond the scope of those three subject matters, they are called back. And the alternate that is nominated by us, the legislature, takes their place. In any vote that they make that's outside the scope of those three subject matters, it's not going to be runaway convention because they can't go out the scope of those three subject matters. But if they go out the scope of those three subject matters, then they are called back. I suggested capital punishment, but I thought that was a little bit harsh. But they are called back. And any vote that they made that was outside the scope of those three subject matters is null and void. Now, no good deed goes unpunished. I heard all these complaints about a runaway convention, and put together this bill to narrowly define, or to very specifically define, what a delegate can and can't do, and what happens if they go beyond the scope. And we have a few people that aren't satisfied with that. It's like the SS Titanic, right? It was a ship that was never supposed to sink. And people took that voyage with that perception that it would never sink. Well, let's use a metaphor. That's just an analogy between the SS Titanic and the United States, our government. So the sink of ship, the Titanic hit the iceberg, is starting to list and it's starting to go down. And there are a few people on board that say, I wouldn't rush those lifeboats. I'm not confident that those lifeboats have navigation equipment on it. And, I don't think it's as competent as this ship is that's almost sinking. I'm not getting on those lifeboats. Well, the founding fathers created a lifeboat. They created an Article 5 is not complex, contrary to what someone said previous to my comments here. Article 5 is very straightforward and very simple. It details the two methods for proposing amendments to the Constitution, not creating amendments to the Constitution, simply proposing them, subject matter. Those two methods are, has been pointed out, Congress has, if 2/3 of Congress agrees to a proposed amendment, that proposed amendment goes to the states for a ratification process, and it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify. It's a high hurdle, and it should be. That's, you can't willy-nilly put something in the Constitution. The second method is when states call for a convention of states for the same purpose, and that purpose is proposing amendments to the Constitution. Not creating amendments, proposing them. And that method also, when 34 states call for a convention of states, they gather together, much like we do in the legislature, And they discuss those three subject matters I mentioned, and they propose language for a proposed amendment. Then it goes, if they agree on one of those or language for proposed amendment, it goes to the states for the ratification process. Same methodology, same safeguards in place, right? So, this is when I took the oath of office, like we all did. I took the oath to uphold the Constitution, both the state and the U.S. Constitution. I didn't go like this, remember when you're kids, if you didn't want to tell the truth, you put the one hand across your fingers and put it behind your back and say, I swear, right? Well, that crossing your fingers meant you really didn't swear. But I swore to the Constitution, uphold the Constitution. Well, guess what? Article 5, in very simple language, gives an alternative for the states to say, look, federal government's getting a little out of hand. I handed this handout to you. $31.5 trillion in debt. And my phone's ringing. I got it in my back pocket, and it's annoying as heck. But this is very telling, right? $31.5 trillion. It's gone up at least $1 trillion in the last year and a half. More importantly, if you look on that information I gave you, debt per citizen is $94,000. When a baby is born, they're born with $94,000 in debt. Debt for taxpayer is $246,000. More importantly, in the bottom, I think that is fundamentally what we should be concerned about, and that is the U.S. federal debt to gross domestic product. All right, gross domestic product is the value of all the goods and services produced in this country in 1 year. That's our wealth and production in 1 year. Well, in 1960, the percentage of our federal debt to gross domestic product was 53%. 1980, 34%. Year 2000, 59%. Here we are 23 years later, and it's 120.37%, 120% of gross domestic product. What does that mean? That means our national debt, federal debt, is 20% more than all the goods and services produced in this country. Think about that. That's amazing. And it's unsustainable, right? And to Chairman Brewer's point with his question, well, so what do we do? Do we lean on one of the two methods in Article 5 for proposing amendments, and that's through Congress? They've all been done that way before. Convention of States has never been called, so we've never tested that. So we're going to depend on the same people, Congress and administrations, and this goes across party line. This accumulated debt didn't happen because of one party. They were kind of locked in arms to spend willy-nilly, like I hate to denigrate sailors, but like drunken sailors at times. And they accumulated that debt. So we're expecting Congress, one of the methods of proposing an amendment to the Constitution, to say, yeah, I think you're right. I think you should tie our hands and have term limits. It's really tying our hands. But yeah, no, they're not going to do that. And we're to propose to Congress, who's in charge of appropriations and spending, to say, oh, you should have a balanced budget, right? No, they're not going to do that. They're not going to do that. So the founding fathers put in place a safeguard. They put in a safeguard in the event that something like this comes to be, and here we are. So, I'm upholding the Constitution. Article 5 is in the Constitution, and I didn't cross my fingers and say, I swear to uphold the Constitution, except for that part in Article 5. That part in Article 5 about states having the authority to call for a convention of states to propose amendments. I uphold the Constitution except for that part. I'll have people come up to me and say, well, this is putting the Constitution at risk. No, I say, you're putting the Constitution at risk by not respecting Article 5. Okay. Any questions? I will try to not spend the rest of the morning answering.
Well, thanks Thanks for that explanation. Question for Senator Holland. Senator Conrad.
Thank you, Senator Halloran. And I know that you've been consistently passionate about these issues during your term of service. And I think that was evident in your closing remarks as well. I just wanted to note, I think that I was conflating kind of a faithful elector kind of proposal in regards to our electoral college votes. And I see here that you're attempting to implement perhaps the work the legislature did previously in kind of spelling out how the delegate to a convention of states may be selected, how they would operate. So I just wanted to apologize for me kind of initially reading it out of context there. And I think the hearing was illuminating to have a better understanding of what you're trying to do in regards to this. And, you know, I think that there's so many fascinating constitutional law questions in relation to these proposals. And we definitely don't have time to have a full debate on the mic about all of those, but I would be very excited to continue those conversations with you and, you know, think creatively as well. If, you know, I'm hearing a lot of the concerns in regards to federal spending and economic policy. I know previous legislatures have utilized other strategies, like even a substantive legislative resolution calling on our members of Congress to take certain actions or to think in certain ways. And that perhaps is another solution that I was thinking about in regards to your testimony, but
I appreciate that. Thank you. If I might add, you know, the balanced budget or the fiscal restraint, I think that's pretty descriptive, but how the language comes about proposing an amendment to do that's another question, right? But that's the process we go through here when we talk about bills. We wean it down to language we think that would be and should be constitutional and that the public would accept. The Swiss have a creative way of doing this. The Swiss have what they call, I think it's called a debt break. Debt break. And what that is, it limits the amount of debt that their country can have as a percentage of their gross domestic product, right? So it wouldn't be, I think, unreasonable. I'm not trying to say this is what would happen or one of the proposals might be, that maybe that our U.S. debt can only be 95% of our gross domestic product. Because people will say, and I'm getting down the scope of what your comments, and I appreciate your comments, Senator. People will say, well, Senator Halloran, we don't really owe this money. The national debt. We don't owe this money. And some people say we owe it to ourselves. And to those people that say, well, we owe it to ourselves, I say, well, if you borrow money from the bank, I would like to be there when you go into the bank and you say, I don't owe this back, I owe it to myself. It doesn't make sense, right? One thing you can't escape for sure, though, what Congress cannot escape is they have to annually pay the interest on the national debt. I think the little sheet pointed out what that is. Maybe it isn't on here, but the interest is right at half a what is it? $500 billion, right? So in that interest, with the interest rates going up like they are, that becomes more of a problem. But my point is, they cannot escape paying the national debt or the interest on the national debt. They have to. Bondholders get a little bit antsy and upset if you don't pay the interest. Principal's another thing, but they want. So my point is, $500 billion can go to a lot of other spending issues that we would maybe rather prioritize than paying interest. There's no bankers in here, so they like the interest coming in. I get that, but we could better prioritize that $500 billion to other programs that benefit American citizens rather than paying the interest on national debt. I spoke too long.
No, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, any additional questions for Senator Halloran? All right, thank you for your close. And then we'll close our hearing on LB 195 and we will get reset. Oh, I got to read in there. Letters, and I got that right here. We had 4 proponents, 3 opponents, none in the neutral. Now we'll close the hearing on LB 195 and reset for LB 31. Senator Halloran, whenever you're ready.
This is kind of an irony that it's Groundhog Day because a lot of because a lot of what we're talking about here. So this may be abbreviated. Hopefully, it will be. But Thank you, Chairman Brewer and members of the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee for the hearing today. For the record, my name is Steve Halloran, STEVEHALLORAN, and I represent the 3rd Legislative District. I'm here today to present my legislative resolution, LR 31, which calls for the state of Nebraska to call for a limited Article 5 Convention of States, which would discuss and potentially propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. It takes 34 states with matching resolutions to call a convention. Currently, 19 states have passed resolutions that match the language in LR 31. In 2023, there were 17 states where there is either active Convention of States legislation or is already passed in one chamber. So a number of other states are looking at the very same language. Once that 34 state threshold is met and Article 5 Convention of States is called, and through a convention process, amendments are proposed. Those proposed amendments would still have to be ratified by 38 states as laid out in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. LR 31 calls for a convention to propose amendments in the following areas. 1, impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. 2, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And 3, limit the terms of officials and for members of Congress. By requiring matching resolutions by 34 states, it naturally creates a structured framework for the topics discussed during the convention. Let me repeat that. By requiring matching resolutions by 34 states, it naturally creates a structured framework for topics discussed during the convention. All 34 states will be disciplined from their own state legislatures to stick to limiting discussions to those 3 topics. I'd like to shift gears a bit and take a few minutes to refute. Maybe I don't need to do this because I already did this. All right, shifting gears a little bit, refute some of the arguments against an Article 5 Convention of States. You will hear the term runaway convention and CONCON. And CONCON refers to the Constitutional Convention, and I think it's a very good piece of marketing because when you think of a con, you think of a convict and it's kind of criminal and so forth. The Constitutional Convention is convened to write a new government charter as was done in 1787 to fix the failed Articles of Confederation. Through that process, the Constitution was created. Note that it took 3 years for the 13 states to ratify the newly created Constitution. Clearly, even that convention was not a runaway convention, not a runaway process. However, an Article 5 Convention of States operates within the U.S. Constitution as a method for proposing amendments to the Constitution, not as an instrument to rewrite the Constitution. Article 5 explicitly states that a convention can only meet for the purpose of proposing amendments. Then there's a fear of a runaway convention. They will tell you that they don't have control of process, that once a convention of states convenes, the delegates from each state will become drunk with their own power and purpose and propose amendments outside the scope of which the convention was called. Remember, 34 states, individual states, with matching resolutions call for an Article 5 Convention of States. Clearly, these states have mutually understood purpose. This committee has just held a hearing on LB 195, Adopt the Faithful Delegates to the Federal Article 5 Convention Act, that will ensure that the Nebraska delegates to an Article 5 convention will be bound to the scope of the subject matter in the state's application to a convention. Other states have adopted similar legislation that would put constraints on their delegates. Second, one could reasonably agree that delegates and commissioners will conduct in a civil manner, much like other interstate compacts. But let's just say, I'm going to jump to the conclusion because I'm becoming quite repetitive from the first proposal. Forgive me for that. We should have done them in different order, and that's my responsibility. With that, I would open up for questions from the committee.
All right, Senator Hunt.
Thank you, Chairman Brewer. Senator Halloran, is this the same LR that you've introduced in the past, but just without the sunset that we passed
That's
before?
correct.
Okay, thank you.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay, no new coffee. Senator Rayburn.
Thank you, Senator Halloran, for all the information you've provided on this. I've learned quite a lot. The question I have is the language that you used. Did you say fiscal restraint or balanced budget? I wasn't sure which was in the.
The subject
LRC.
matter is, one of the three subject matters is fiscal restraint on the part of counties.
So how is that further defined? What does fiscal restraint mean? What is it understood? Because sometimes people have way different interpretations. Fiscal restraint means quit taxing us to death. That could be, one of the most common interpretations that people say, quit taxing us to death. And so that doesn't go to the subject matter that I think is really relevant and important, is balancing the budget. So I figured that gives way too much, flexibility in subject matter or subject jurisdiction that we're trying to be consistent on as we go forward, because some of the points Mr. Dodge raised to me are quite relevant. Who is pushing for this? Who is funding the push for things like this? And that's also very, very, very important to any discussion and dialogue, because it could open up so many varied interpretations. But I know that you've studied it a lot longer than I have. Tell me what you think that interpretation means.
I think when I suggested that, for example, the alternate method that another country uses, a fiscal break, the Swiss used that. Fiscal restraint is something that I think every family understands, right? Within the confines of the income that they have and expenses that they have to show fiscal restraint. Now, how they interpret that, I think it's pretty universal. They have to stay within the confines of what they have to spend. So we could have put in their balanced budget amendment, but that would have confined it to that, right? It would have been a balanced budget amendment. And quite honestly, that, narrowing it down to that subject matter would have said, well, we can't talk about a fiscal break. It's a balanced budget amendment. So just like we are not sent here with confined direction from our constituents when they vote us in at a convention of states, much like as in the legislature, they will discuss the definition of what fiscal restraint means, and they'll propose something. And again, it's a proposal. The states, when they go through the ratification process, may say, no, we don't want it.
Well, thank you for that. But I just hear so many conflicting ideas. I know in Congress today, they talk about fiscal restraint. And in one interpretation is we got to quit hiring so many people in the IRS department because they're going after individuals that they don't need to be going after. So to them, fiscal restraint means we got to really limit the amount of people that are working in that department. I, as a business person, say, oh my gosh, why would you restrict a department that is a revenue source that helps keep our country fiscally sound, that contributes the preponderance of wealth that allows us to manage our resources. And to me, revenue, and I think Mr. Dodge said that very clearly, revenue is essential to look at the entire picture. And so people have so many different ways of interpreting fiscal restraint that, if it were really clear, and I understand what you said, that there has to be an agreement on a debt cap or a debt limit or a debt break point. I get that, but I just have some concerns about how people can go down a rabbit hole that might not be to the benefit of.
Now that's very good. I've not heard the rabbit hole analogy. That's very good.
I hear it all the time.
I understand their concerns, but people have those same kind of concerns that they have with us and our process, or Congress with their process. I will make one minor correction. The IRS is not a financial source. We are the financial source in the IRS. Audits that. We are the financial source.
I understand that.
Taxpayers are the financial source.
Okay, additional questions, Senator Conrad.
Thank you so much. And just Senator Halloran, just to follow up on your exchange with Senator Hunt, I had a chance as a citizen observer to watch the process play out in the last biennial. And I know you worked closely with Senator DeBoer and others to kind of forge a compromise to help the resolution move forward. And that included, I think it was a 5-year sunset proposal on that. So as you're bringing this forward, I just wanted to ask, and I think we're all clear-eyed about how political processes work. Are you bringing this forward because you see a change in the political landscape in Nebraska in the legislature this year to move this without the sunset? Or do you think the sunset in and of itself was suspect from a legal or policy perspective? Because I asked not to be glib about it, but because,
Sure.
looking at, say, for example, the Equal Rights Amendment, I've read a lot about whether or not states can rescind their resolutions in support of that and how that fits into the historical and larger picture. And I think there's some fascinating open questions across the political spectrum and across time about how we utilize these processes. So sorry to be long-winded, but my question is the removal of the 5-year sunset, so to speak, is it political? Is it substantive? Is it both? If you could just help me to understand a little bit more about your thinking here.
Oh, I appreciate the question. Primarily, it's I think Mr. Dodge used the reference that LR 14, which is what we were talking about, that was passed with the sunset, went through too fast.
Okay.
It might have gone through early in that session, but believe me, it didn't go through too fast. I mean, I had been involved with this for the last 5 years prior to me. Senator did it. Senator Epke did it for 2-3 years before that. There's nothing fast about 7 or 8 years. So, but no, and so that's part of my argument for taking the sunset away is that it takes a lot of time to get something like this in place, and I didn't want to put that burden on future senators once it was sunset to say, hey, we need to revisit this issue and do this again and take another 7-8 years to do that. Now, keep in mind, the executive board has the authority, and we see it from time to time almost every year. The executive board, people can propose a resolution to the executive board to rescind any previous calls for a convention of state. And put it in front of the legislature to do that. So there is a means of rescinding a call for a convention of states, and I think that's adequate to do it that way.
Yeah, and I think what I'm reading from the literature is that perhaps it's an open question about whether or not those rescissions are effective or kind of how it fits into the grand scheme of things. And I'm almost wondering if it might be a good idea separate or distinct from this measure that you're proposing today, if maybe we work together as a government committee or with the executive board, maybe on a broader interim study, just to make sure that there's a clear understanding of the process, kind of an inventory of what Nebraska has put forward in regards to changes to our federal constitution, attempts to rescind them and what that might mean, and how it works into, we can't find future legislators in the federal, but there's so many fascinating questions is my point, is my long-winded point there. And I think particularly in the term limits era and dynamic, as you just noted, it would be helpful to have kind of a clear framework or primer available to all stakeholders to make sure that we have a clear understanding of our history and treatment of these issues in Nebraska. So I'd be excited to work with you on something like that.
And I open up, I'm termed out in this last 2 years of my term. I will give you all an open invitation to ask me back to be a guest speaker.
There you have it. All right. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Now, for when the time your bill or your LR 14 passed until now, has the federal government done anything to restrain the budget or implement term limits?
Okay, if they have it, it would be a surprise that I have not heard of that.
All right, well, all right, so those things haven't changed since your past, they're just trying to make it there. Now, one of the reasons I think maybe there was concerns about using the term balanced budget, if we were to do that, is as opposed to fiscal restraint, I know on the Department of Defense side, if you balance the budget, which I mean, sounds great in theory, but in reality, you would collapse the system right now because we have got used to this, fat cow, and to get the cow skinnier, your roads, your bridges, your Department of Defense. I mean, all these things that make America what it is probably could not sustain itself. Now, fiscal restraint could help you start thinning the cow down, but balanced budget, I think, would probably be detrimental. That's why I think the verbiage was there. I'm just guessing. I don't know for a fact. I wasn't in DC to hear any of this, but I think if you look at it, that would be a more reasonable approach than a fixed balanced budget, because Nebraska, we do have the luxury. Our Department of Defense, we have a military department, fairly small part of our budget, because really it's the federal government that's helping us make all that happen. Our roads, the majority of the money there is coming from the federal government. Same with major bridge operations and stuff. So, I mean, am I off track, or is this the way you see this?
No, I pretty much agree with all that. I mean, the balanced budget, to Senator Rabel's conversation and question about a balanced budget, if we had a balanced budget amendment in the Constitution, I think very clear language that would require a balanced budget. There's two ways to balance a budget, or a combination of two ways, but two ways to balance a budget. One is restraining spending. The other one is increasing taxes or income, right? Income. So I'm a little hesitant to have a balanced budget amendment for the simple purpose that if it was an amendment in the Constitution, we would be giving carte blanche authority by the Constitution for Congress to spend whatever they want, because they would say, look, we got to balance the budget. The way we're going to do it's going to increase taxes, and give little credence to the other side of the equation, like all businesses have to do or households have to do, and look at the spending side of it. So fiscal restraint, I think, is a very good descriptive term for the general subject that they talk about.
Okay. Additional questions for Senator Halloran? All right, thank you. And let's see. You're going to stick around for close again.
I am.
Good.
Gosh, I thought that was the close.
All right, on LR 31, we will start with the proponents. Proponents, come on up. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Thanks, Senator.
Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
My name's Stephen Steinkuehler, Stevenstinkuehler. Currently, I am a volunteer with Convention of States, Nebraska. I serve as a legislative liaison, and have been with Convention of States since 2019. I don't have a lot to say, except I support Senator Halloran and his objective and what he's trying to accomplish. But I do think I have some additional information that, based on some of the questions, senators on this side, if you flip to the second page of that, you will see the metrics that are associated with where Convention of States is. I hope that's self-explanatory. That first section is states that have passed a COS application, and then states that have got it through one of the houses in their legislature. And this is repetitive, but I think it's consistent. And I'll just read this. You guys can follow along. In Article 5, Convention of States is a constitutional tool provided by our founders to empower the American people to hold their government accountable. This is accomplished by proposing amendments to the Constitution. And then somewhat repetitive, but in conjunction with what the senator has already talked about, are the three elements that, from a Convention of States perspective, they're seen as an aggregate component that flows from all the states that pass this legislation. Additionally, as has been already alluded to, 34 states need to pass the resolution, and 38 can ratify the Constitution. That's a high bar. Any way you look at it, that's a high bar. You asked about guardrails. That might be considered a good guardrail. Okay, so we had, and then 19 states have passed the COS resolution to call for an Article 5 convention, and you've got that information. And then I was up around 4 o'clock this morning. I really put some thought into this, and I'll say it verbatim, but, I'm old enough now that I've reached the point where I think I could say that. And I believe that individuals have taken time in today's fast-paced, ever-changing world to step back, take a deep breath, and think seriously about what is working and what is not working in our country these days. What we might need to change and what we are willing to risk in order to impact change. We are all very fortunate that we live in a country where this is possible. Article 5 offers each state's citizens working with their state's legislature this opportunity. Let's make the most of this opportunity. In Nebraska, we have 22,000 individuals that have signed petitions in support of where we're going with this legislation. With that, I'll be quiet and take any questions you might have.
All right. Thank you, sir. All right. Questions for Steve? Yes, Senator Conrad.
Thank you, Dr. Steinkuhler. Really appreciate your testimony and the background and information. And I just had 2 questions to figure out if your organization had a position on these issues. And if not, I'm happy to follow up after the hearing too. But did your Convention of States organization believe that states can effectuate, that they can rescind calls for a Convention of States? Do you believe that is allowable under the Article 5 process?
That I don't know.
Okay, I'm trying to sort through those same
Well, I'm
thorny
trying to
questions,
put
so I
that in
just
my-
wanted to know kind of
in my
what.
memory bank so I can.
No, and we can follow up after the
Okay,
hearing
happy to
too.
do
And it was just the same question in regards to the LR 14 from last year about whether or not you thought the sunset was permissible in calling for a Convention of States or not.
We do.
So,
I would support that.
okay,
Yes.
thank you so much.
Thanks, Senator.
Okay. Additional questions? Senator Raymond.
Thank you, Dr. Steinkuhler, for coming and starting your day at 4 a.m. So I appreciate that.
That's not normal, just.
We know you're prepared. So I'm looking at it at the handout. It says once 2/3 or 34 of the states pass a resolution, the convention will be called. And then the next line, it says it takes 38 of the states to ratify the Constitution.
Mhm.
So when the states get together, they're going to, I thought for what Senator Halloran stated, that they make proposals that go to Congress.
Yes.
So,
Oh, no.
No.
Where's Senator going to go?
Did they make proposals to Congress that the Congress then puts out to the states?
All the states.
So I'm sorry, help me walk through the process.
I better let Senator do that. Do you understand? All right, thank you.
So, you'll take it in close. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right. Additional questions? I had not seen this breakout of the states and the date that they had passed the application. So this is good. Thank you. Appreciate
Bet,
that.
Senator.
All right. Well, no other questions. Thank you for your testimony.
Thanks.
Okay. Additional proponents to LR 31. All right. We will transition to opponents to LR 31.
I'll go again. Sherry St. Clair, SHERI-STCLAIR, on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. I'm not going to repeat, all of our objections. They're identical to what they were to the previous bill. I think one to point out is simply that a single issue would be preferred to these multi-issue proposals. And secondly, we have previously passed legislation that is still in effect, going to be in effect for several more years. And I think that once their limit is reached, it's up to a future legislature to determine whether or not they want to continue to pursue calling for an Article 5 constitutional convention. So
Okay. Additional questions for sure. All right. Thank you for your testimony.
thank you.
Okay. Additional opponents to R31. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you. Wesley Dodge again, WESLEY-DODGE from Omaha, and I'm associated with Represent Us. Mr. Clark sent me a note after my last testimony about a statement I made where I said I thought that the Article 5 had passed in about 2 weeks. The reason I thought that is because the legislative session in 22 opened on January 5th, and the Article 5 resolution was passed on January 22nd, 17 days later. So I'm not real refined on what maybe passes or what doesn't go to committee and that kind of thing. So excuse my confusion there, but I looked at the start of the session and I looked at when the bill passed and it was 17 days. So, and I thought that was 1 or 2 weeks. I was watching for committee hearings at that time. I don't recollect a committee hearing, or if it was, sometimes those slip through and people don't see those. So he had asked me to clarify the record on that. And I'm not going to be redundant like Ms. Sinclair suggested too. I'm not going to go through my spiel again. But while I was sitting, I did look up. There's like 5 or 6 pending things out there as far as the federal budget is concerned, Senator Brewer, that there's a Simpson-Bowles Act, which was kind of set aside, but there's a modification of that now where they've got percentages like Senator Halloran was discussing, where if we raise revenue by 21%, which we can do by getting rid of a lot of the loopholes and the exemptions that exist right now, if we tax corporations and we're more effective with our collections with the IRS, we could raise that by 21%. There's 2 resolutions that if we reduce our debt to 60% of their GDP, and then there's a second one that's 21%. So they're out there. You all have better connections with our senators right now than I do. So you could talk to Ricketts or you could talk to Fisher and say, hey, these are out there. Let's start driving those. And again, I won't be redundant with my testimony, but I wanted to clear up the record. Thank you, Mr. Clark, for making me aware of that. And I still am in the same position. I don't think this is a good idea. As far as the process is concerned, just very quickly, and I won't try to steal his thunder, but they propose amendments and then they go to the states for ratification. So it's like in our original Second Continental Congress, they have the meetings, they come up with the amendments, et cetera, and then they're ratified by the states again. So.
And that number's 38.
It's
34 triggers.
Yeah, 38 to ratify.
Okay, any additional questions? Senator Rabel.
So I think you mentioned a good point of reconciling our budget by some of the proposals that are out there that we can encourage our federal senators to propose. Did that include that you briefly mentioned Senator Elizabeth Warren's proposal where it really targets those multi-million-dollar earners that pay virtually no taxes? Is that in the
I think that's part of it. I just, because Senator Brewer brought it up, I Googled, and you know how trustworthy that always is, so I hate to be held to it, but I found a good site that actually broke down several different methods of trying to rectify these problems. Can't find it right now quickly what I was just looking at, but they had like 4 or 5 of them. And it's like a mortgaged house. It's going to take 30, 40 years, but it took us longer than that to get there, right? So we started quadrupling it or whatever back in the mid 80s. I think I've read recently that a quarter of the debt we have right now has occurred in the last 4 or 5 years, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what I had read. So
it has accelerated. Additional questions? Okay, now just for clarity, so What you're proposing is the way out of this is taxation.
When you run a household budget or a country's budget, you need income to pay your expenses. So yes, that we fund our government through taxes. Yes, we need taxes. It's not carte blanche, let's tax everything. I mean, I think the 60% tax that people are proposing on consumption goods, it would be really detrimental. I think there's places we're not recovering taxes that we could be recovering taxes. Again, I don't profess to be a tax expert, and I don't want to say anything that gets anybody's ire up, but I've read things about taxation of assets earned in foreign countries that we don't tax enough. We got to watch that. There's all kinds of exemptions and things like that. When I was in law school, the tax code is twice as big as the Bible, so there's a lot of stuff in there that people have become experts at doing, and the people who benefit the most by it put the most money into making sure we don't resolve those issues. We could make it real simple. I really do think we could. I think in the 20s or 30s, didn't we do it by a postcard? I think I remember reading that. It's like, what did you make? Pay 3%. Here you go.
Okay. Any additional questions? Thank you for your testimony.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Additional opponents. Holy cow, this is Groundhog Day. Gavin, welcome back.
Chairman Brewer, members of the committee, good morning. My name is Gavin Geis. That's spelled Gavingeis, and I am the executive director for Common Cause Nebraska. Nice to see you again on just such a short timeline. Typically, I don't read straight from testimony, but there's some technical aspects here that I want to get right. So I'll be reading today. Common Cause opposes an Article 5 convention for many reasons, including the absence of authority on how a convention would be governed and the threat of a runaway convention that could pose to all of our constitutional rights. But specifically regarding LR 31, we believe the resolution it rescinds, LR 14, is a better vehicle for an Article 5 application. To begin with, we believe there's good reason to retain the sunset provision contained in LR 14. This provision was part of a compromise reached by this body that allowed LR 14 to pass. That alone would be good enough reason to retain the provision, but there's good reason to place a sunset provision in any Article 5 application. Courts have noted that regarding Article 5, states are the weather vane for public support of issues requiring constitutional change. As such, this legislature should be frequently reviewing all of our Article 5 applications to gauge public interest in support of the matters contained in them. The alternative is that resolutions sit on our books indefinitely, and the state ignores its role engaging in local interests. As such, we believe it's wise to retain the sunset provision in LR 14 and review this matter again in 5 years. I want to note there was a mention of rescission. That has been brought up before in the executive board. It has never found ground, even for issues as controversial as interracial marriage. We have resolutions on our books from decades and decades ago. And there is no interest in rescission. So I think a better measure is to include a sunset provision rather than relying on a hope that we can rescind the bad ones as we go. Beyond the sunset requirement, the additional provisions contained in Section 2 complicate the call and will ultimately make it difficult to convene any convention. These are not contained in LR 14. The provisions in Section 2 are all unsettled legal questions and will lead to great debate should a convention be called. Regarding limiting Congress's role in a convention, there is good reason to believe that both Congress and the courts would disagree with one or more of the provisions contained in LR 31. Over the years, multiple bills have been introduced by the Congress to establish rules for an Article 5 convention. Clearly, there's a belief in Congress that they have some authority here. Additionally, the U.S. Supreme Court has already shown a willingness to expand Congress's powers under Article 5. In Dillon v. Gloss, the court held that Congress has the authority to set a time limit for the ratification of constitutional amendments, despite the fact that that is mentioned nowhere in Article 5. As such, it's no stretch to believe that courts will hold that Congress has additional authority regarding an Article 5 convention, even if it's not explicitly noted in the convention. In light of the unsettled nature of these provisions, we believe it wise to leave them out of the official application and avoid the complications they will create. Finally, several of the provisions in Section 2 raise questions of how they'll actually be applied. In particular, Section 2B states that a convention will only be convened when applications of substantially the same purpose are received or are received from the required states. Given the purposes contained in LR 14 and LR 31, what will constitute substantially the same purpose? If 33 states call for a convention on just term limits, will our call be included as the 34th? Or must the applications include all of the elements of this call to be substantially the same purpose? Likewise, if 33 states call for a convention that could be said to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, will this application be included under Section 2B? Section 2H raises similar questions by restricting the convention to topics contained in this resolution. The purpose of this application includes imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, as well as to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Under my reading, this is a fairly broad call and implies many matters. Would 2H restrict Nebraska's call for a convention to one using only the exact wording of the resolution's call, or would other state applications on issues of fiscal restraint and limiting the federal government capture Nebraska's application as well? Given the good reason to retain the sunset provision and the potential complications created by Section 2, we believe this body should reject LR 31 and retain LR 14 as a better example of a state application for a convention. Thank you. That is all I
Kevin, I
have.
think we had this conversation before. You're not an attorney.
I'm not an attorney?
Are you an attorney?
Oh, I am an attorney. Unfortunately, yes.
You sound like one.
I'm sorry.
You're very detailed, you're concise, you break it out, and keeping up with you is the hard part, because you go faster than I can read. But I appreciate the fact that you're very thorough, you're very detailed, and you must have made those notes this morning, because it's pretty rare that your testimony isn't set in front of me as you go through it. So is that a good guess?
It is a good guess. I was a little busy with, yesterday's
How many
hearing.
pages you got there? You've been working. All right, any questions for Gavin? Thanks for coming in, and
You'll see me again.
I may have to call you up and catch up at some point here, because I had a couple of notes, but I can't even catch up with my notes to ask the question right now. But
No worries.
thank you. All right, next opponent to LR 31. Come on up. You're in the front row. You're in the right place. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Hi there. My name's Arlo Hettle, ARLOHETTLE. I'm the Grassroots Advocacy Coordinator at the Nebraska Civic Engagement Table, which is a member organization serving around 70 other nonpartisan nonprofit organizations across the state. Our mission is to ensure every community across the state has the opportunity to have a seat at the table and be involved in the policy decisions that affect their lives. I'm not an attorney. Gavin, I think, said a lot of what I was going to say a lot more thoroughly than I would be able to. So I just kind of want to echo that we're concerned that LR 31 could potentially radically change the Constitution without the ability for involvement from everyday people that these changes would affect. We see here in Nebraska where it's so easy for people to be able to speak to their representative, have that input in their government, and we're just really concerned that an Article 5 constitutional convention would move away from that philosophy completely. Particularly if there are outside actors and special interests that are going to be playing a large role in this. We would rather be focusing here on building a generation of civic leaders, getting people involved in their communities, and turning out more voices to the ballot box. And so we would ask you to oppose LR 31. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Questions for all? All right, thank you for coming in. Okay, next opponent, LR 31. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Good morning, Chairman Brewer and members of the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee. My name is Joey Adler-Ruane, JOEY-ADLER space RUANE, and I am the Policy Director with Open Sky Policy Institute, testifying today in opposition to LR 31. The need to use great care with taxpayer dollars is essential at all levels of government. We are concerned by LR 31's call for fiscal restraints such as a balanced budget amendment at the federal level. Such limitations would worsen economic downturns and reduce the federal funding that many Nebraskans depend on. Going into debt at the federal level works to stabilize the economy during recessionary periods. During an economic downturn, businesses and consumers spend less, which leads to job losses. Federal stimulus helps cushion the economic blow and keeps the purchases of goods and services from falling further. This is why macroeconomic advisors, an economic forecasting firm, found that recessions would be deeper and longer under a constitutional balanced budget amendment. Had one been in place during the Great Recession, they found that the effect on the economy would be catastrophic and would have doubled the unemployment rate. This is also why more than 1,000 economists, including 11 Nobel laureates, issued a joint statement condemning a constitutional balanced budget amendment that was considered by Congress in 1997, warning that it would mandate perverse actions and aggravate recessions. There's hardly a better example of this than the 2020 stimulus packages passed in response to the economic fallout of COVID-19. To balance the budget, such legislation would have had to have resulted in corresponding tax increases so that the nation would not take on debt. To avoid this outcome during crises, a constitutional amendment would need to include exceptions that account for every scenario that could require sudden and unexpected government spending. A balanced budget amendment would also have severe consequences for nearly all Nebraskans by reducing federal support for communities throughout the state, including farmers, retirees, and veterans. In 2019, federal dollars accounted for more than 27% of appropriations of all fund sources in Nebraska and 31.5% during the Great Recession in fiscal year 09. In FY19 alone, federal funding accounted for more than $952 million of K through 12 and higher education budgets in Nebraska. Without federal funding for education, Nebraska taxpayers would be responsible for an additional $653 per adult to make up for the lost revenue. Such a loss of federal funding would likely exacerbate current frustrations with property taxes. A significant amount of federal dollars come to Nebraska through defense-related spending as well. In FY19, the Department of Defense spent $1.6 billion in Nebraska. Over $900 million of these dollars directly pay for 16,501 personnel, with another $700 million doing the jobs in the private sector through contracts with the DoD. Furthermore, in 2019, Nebraska farmers received $950 million in direct federal payments. Eliminating some or all of these programs would be extremely harmful to many Nebraskans. We appreciate the concerns about improper spending, which is why we support efforts to improve the transparency of tax incentives and other tax expenditures at the state and local levels. We are always interested in the spending of taxpayer dollars being monitored and evaluated on their merit. It's for these reasons we urge the committee to oppose LR 31. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? You heard my comments earlier, I hope, about I don't support the balanced budget either. I mean, the concept I do. The problem is, realistically, the impact would be incredibly painful right now because of how large our government and our budget is. And I would guess that's why they are focusing on fiscal restraint instead of balanced budget. Do you see an opening where fiscal restraint might be something we should look toward?
I think that anytime that we try and have some transparency about the way in which taxpayer dollars are spent is a good thing. But I don't know that fiscal transparency is necessarily as defined as maybe we would like it to be in order for us to, give you a more definitive answer on that. I would be happy to sit down and talk with you about what that could mean, though.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Appreciate you coming in. All right. We are still on opponents to LR 31. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Jim Froman, JIMFROHMAN. I'm here to testify in opposition to LR 31, but first let me say that I believe the federal government needs to be fixed and that Congress is incapable of fixing itself, and that the only way the many issues needing to be fixed will get fixed is through an Article 5 constitutional convention. My opposition to LR 31 is not with its intent, but with its implementation. The convention called for in LR 31 will never happen. It is a waste of time to pursue it, especially when there is an alternative that could succeed. LR 31 and other similar issue-based calls will never be passed by the required 34 states. It is simple math. To reach 34 with LR 31 or similar conservative issue-based calls will require all Republican-controlled states, plus all 11 divided states, plus one democratically controlled state to sign on. This will never happen. I cannot imagine a scenario where this could happen. It is a waste of time and energy to pursue issue-based calls for an Article 5 constitutional convention. There is a way to successfully call for a convention. An issue-neutral call with a framework for the convention could be passed by both conservative, liberal, and divided state governments. It is the only way to 34. It is the only way the issues you care about will ever be considered at a constitutional convention. I previously emailed all of you, most of you at least, and this morning, all of you, my suggestion for a call for constitutional convention. I'm not going to go into the specifics unless you have questions. I support the intent of LR 31, but I cannot support a bill that has no future and cannot achieve its goal. The call for Article 5 Constitutional Convention in LR 31 will never succeed. And I have a couple of really quick additional points based on the testimony so far. Congress has, this is an assumption, but there have been more than enough calls for constitutional convention since the beginning of this country to have had a constitutional convention. My assumption, and I believe it's accurate, is that Congress has basically ignored these, and their justification is that they have not received 34 identical calls for a constitution. I can't think of any other reason other than literally saying I'm going to ignore it, and it could be both. The current LR 31 does not match 19 previous, or 18 actually, previous calls for a constitutional convention by the COS Action Group. So effectively, if this were to pass, we have taken ourselves out of that, and we no longer are part of that 19 member states, assuming Congress is in fact demanding identical calls. And nowhere in Article 5 is that stated that that has to happen, but that is the justification Congress is using. So if you pass this, you have taken yourself out of the COS calls. You're no longer a member of that group, and you've guaranteed further that it will never happen. The other quick note, and I am not a lawyer, but I have done extensive research. There's been a whole bunch of questions about this, and you can take any one of the questions you may have, and you can find 50 people on either side that will tell you you're right, you're wrong, and whatever. So studying this issue more will get nowhere, frankly, because it's been studied and there's opinions to go galore. The only way those opinions will ever be put into concrete and decided is if the call actually happens. Then things will happen. Then there'll be court cases. Then there'll actually be decisions made, and we will have an understanding of what Article 5 means at that point in time. Today, it means whatever person you're talking to. So thank you for your time and your service.
All right, thank you, Jim. Questions? All right, let me at least hit you with one here. Yesterday was kind of a long day, and last night was a short night. And so forgive us if we're just a little weary today trying to get focused on things. I know Senator Halloran, and I'll be looking forward to his close to talk about this, has spent 6 years I know of working hard to try and figure out what right looks like and how we get there. So the analogy used of the Titanic, kind of does make you stop and pause and think for a second. Are we one of them that's listening to the music and not paying attention to where the water line's coming up on the ship? But if what you're saying is true, it doesn't really leave a lot of hope that there's any way to save the ship here. I mean, what's your response to that?
Well, my response, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but an issue neutral call where you're not presenting conservative issues or liberal issues or in-between issues is the first step, because you just can't get to 34 if you're promoting liberal or you're promoting conservative issues. You just can't do it. The math is there. I don't know why people are refusing to do it. Look at the math, but it's simple. And I'd love to have somebody tell me where I'm wrong. You can't get there. So you have to have an issue neutral call and to deal with all of the issues that people do bring up about a convention, and there are some legitimate issues people do bring up, the runaway and other issues, I propose putting a framework within the call that addresses those issues and basically prevents some of the concerns that you would see with a constitutional convention. So the call would actually have an embedded framework. It would be issue neutral. So it could be supported by liberals, could be supported by conservatives, could be supported by in between, the divided states. It would actually have a chance to reach 34. And to use the Titanic example, where I see it, in my case, the example that was used is if you already have a convention, and then how does that work once you have it? The Titanic would have never been launched, is what I'm saying. It would have never made it out to the ocean because they couldn't complete it. And we'll never complete reach 34 as I anticipate.
The issue I see though is everyone talks about guardrails. How about guardrails? Everybody wants guardrails so that whatever issue they don't want talked about doesn't get talked about, and that they know what is going to be talked about. If we leave the whiteboard open and just charge in there, the fear on everyone's part would be such as no one would want to move forward with that, because they see guardrails as a safety, not as I don't know, limitation that you see it as in getting the support.
Well, in my suggestion, there's two pieces that I'll respond to. One is I limit the number of amendments that can be proposed. Each state would have 3 amendments that they could propose. So that puts a limit and prevents a runaway, because you could only have 150 amendments at max. And more than likely, many of those would be duplicates, some of them at least. But anyway, so that puts a limit there. The guardrail concept, frankly, is a way to limit to what you want. So conservatives limit it to conservative issues, liberals limit it to liberal issues. So if to use an example that was brought up in terms of this is just how the legislature works, well, you don't come into legislative session saying we're only going to deal with conservative issues or we're only going to deal with liberal issues. You come in with an open chart and you deal with whatever issues is put forward by the different senators when they submit their bills. That's how this would work. It's still under state control. The legislature still have the controlling interest through various mechanisms in my proposal. So the limit of the 3 bills or 3 amendments would be, and per state would be the guardrail in terms of preventing a runaway. So if you're using a guardrail in that sense, there are pieces in what I'm suggesting that would handle that. But it would leave it open to any state to bring anything they want forward. And yes, some state, I doubt it, but some state could bring some really crazy things forward. But as has been noted, and in my example, you'd have to get 60% of the people in the convention to approve that. And if by some crazy miracle you got some crazy amendment out of a constitutional convention, you still have to get 38 states to approve it. So there's plenty of guardrails there, and the guardrails that I propose are open enough to actually let a constitutional convention act as a legislature.
So, all right, well, thank you for your testimony. Let me double check. Okay. Thanks for coming in. It's nice to have someone who isn't a hired gun. They're here on their own, so appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, next opponent. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Hello, Chairman Brewer and members of the committee. My name is Heidi Ewing, HEIDIUHING, and I'm the hired gun for Civic Nebraska.
Good.
I'll be testifying in opposition to LR 31. The resolution specifies that the convention would be limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and members of Congress. This is an incredibly broad scope of changes that could be made. A balanced budget amendment is the clear priority of the Convention of States, the primary organization supporting this effort. But every agency, every dollar of state aid, and every subsidy to farmers, schools, and businesses would be at risk. As voting rights advocates, Civic Nebraska opposes an Article 5 convention because the Department of Justice, voters' last line of defense against state infringement on voting rights, would be exposed. As Nebraskans, we oppose this resolution because a balanced budget amendment would throw our state budget into chaos. If a balanced budget amendment were passed, Congress would determine where to make cuts in order to balance that budget. There'd be nothing preventing drastic reductions in the state aid that this legislature relies on to conduct Nebraska's state government. In 2018, federal dollars comprised 30% of our state budget. It's easy to criticize out of control federal spending, but an Article 5 convention would, in every likely scenario, result in devastating financial impacts, not only to the federal government, but to our Nebraska state budget. As most of you recall, the legislature spent considerable time debating this issue last session, and a deal was struck to rescind Nebraska's application in 2027. For all the reasons above, and the fact that this matter was very recently addressed by the legislature, we ask that you not advance LR 31.
Okay, thank you. Questions? All right, thank you for coming in. We are still on opponents. LR 31. Those in the neutral, LR 31. Senator Holler, would you like to close on LR 31?
Well, I would love to waive, but there was plenty
Not
to
enough.
discuss. Not going to happen. So, I will applaud Mr. Froman for suggesting something that is unconstitutional. And what he was proposing was a constitutional convention. Let's make it clear, definitions are important. Article 5 defines a convention of states as a convention to propose amendments, as we've discussed, right? By definition, a constitutional convention, which is Article 5 is commonly referred to as a constitutional convention, it's misleading because by definition, the constitutional convention is by design, its purpose is to design a new constitution. So what he was proposing was every state, 50 states, 3 amendments apiece. Oh my gosh, people are getting upset with these 3 narrowly defined subject matters, and he's proposing 150. So I would suggest that shouldn't happen because that indeed would be a con. Okay. I respect all the other all the others that were in opposition. I respect them, but I didn't hear too many solutions. Just didn't hear too many solutions, right? We're passing this debt on to our kids, and that's okay. That's fine. Look, at my age, I can probably survive the economy no matter, the direction's not good right now, but whatever it throws at me, I can probably survive it. I'm a tough enough old gizzard. I won't eat roadkill off the road like Senator Brewer will, but I can survive. But that being said, my kids and grandkids, no, I don't know. I think there's nothing more immoral and unjust than passing debt on to your kids. And that's what we're doing, right? Fiscal restraint is not going to, the sky won't fall. I think it's something that's very important because our kids do deserve better than having us pass debt to them. I could go on, but I appreciate and respect the committee's time, and I have one more bill, and I want to respect my own time on that. So.
Just as a refresher, when you started this process many, many years ago, when you handed one of these out, I want to say in 2017, do you remember what the number was?
I don't. I should have kept better.
I believe it was about 10 trillion less than this.
I would say that would be
It seemed like it was around 22, and now we're at 31.5.
But
all right. Any questions for Senator Holleran? Senator Rabel.
Thank you for all the information you have shared with us. So help me understand. Okay, so in order to call the convention, 34 states have to agree on calling a convention, correct?
On the same subject.
Okay.
And to re-clarify, it was suggested before that there's 19 states that have signed on to the resolution with those 3 subject matters. LR 31 has those same 3 subject matters in it, so it's the same thing. Okay. And there are 17 other states who have the same resolution language that they're considering. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
And then how many of those, say they're all convened, they're working on amendments. What is the percentage or number that they have to agree on? Is it like if they get a 50, if a majority agrees on this amendment, then it gets kicked out and then it has to hit all the states to get ratified? So what is the threshold? Once they're convened, they come up with an amendment.
I understand.
And I guess, let's say they only have 34 states participating.
It would be governed by Mason's rules. In 2017, I went to a convention of states, actually, it was a convention of states in Phoenix, Arizona, initiated by Arizona to call for a convention of states for the sole purpose of writing the rules and regulations for conducting a convention of states. It was very well disciplined. I went not representing Nebraska because I didn't get early enough authority from the speaker, from the legislature to represent, but I went as an observer, right? So I wasn't a delegate there. And that was my fault. I should have asked for it sooner. Anyway, that whole process was very, very disciplined and organized, and it broke up into committees to deal with these various kinds of questions of how a convention would be conducted. And it was all done under Mason's rules. And it has the same kind of format that a legislature does have on dealing with how many votes does it take, simple majority, plurality, and so forth. So it's not willy-nilly. It would be set up very similar to what our state legislature is.
But so do all those 34 states have to agree on Mason's rules?
They have to subscribe early on in the process. They will have to all agree on the rules, which is only right.
Because it's not called out in the Constitution, the federal U.S. Constitution. What is the agreement once they convene on the amendments? That's not
and
spelled
really,
out.
if you look at the Constitution, it doesn't define the rules and regulations for Congress to conduct itself either.
Okay,
Right.
so in theory, you could have 17 states that come to an agreement that this is a great amendment to kick out and start the ratification process. Is that correct or no? If there are 34 states, they're all convened in 17 states.
Trust me, there'll be virtually every state's going to be represented because they'd be foolhardy not to be there represented, right? So there'll be 50 states represented. So it's not going to be these 34 states show up that are all in agreement on having a call for convention of states. In every state, it's going to be one state, one vote, right? They'll have 3 delegates a minimum. It's whatever the body decides for the number of delegates, but Congress won't have any say over that. They're not to govern what a convention of states does. It should not be their authority. They're a second authority that can do the same process, but they're not going to govern the authority of how a convention of states is called.
Okay, let's say there's 50.
Okay.
50 states all show up.
Yep.
And so 25 states could kick out an amendment, depending upon subject matter and if that's how
Right.
Mason rules hold it. So 25 could kick it out. Okay,
If that's the rules they agree on, and I would imagine it would be, yes. Okay.
that cleared up my
Okay.
confusion. Thank you.
Additional questions for Senator Hall? All right, we have some letters to read in. Let's see, letters in support. Proponents 18, opponents 10, neutral 0. With that, we will close the hearing on LR 31 and reset for LB 194.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. There was a song like that.
That's right.
Mr. Cotta.
All right, Senator Halloran, welcome
Okay,
back to
good
your
afternoon.
committee.
Good afternoon, Chairman Brewer, members of the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee. Thank you for this hearing. For the record, my name is Senator Steve Halloran, STEVEHALLORAN, and I represent the 33rd Legislative District. I'm here today to introduce LB 194, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, to the committee for your consideration. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution of the State of Nebraska, titled Bill of Rights, declares, and I quote, "All persons are by nature free and independent and have certain inherent and inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." End of quote. In 1988, the people of Nebraska voted in an almost 2-to-1 margin to amend this section and add, and I quote, "in the right to keep and bear arms for the security or defense of the self, family, home, and others, and for lawful common defense, hunting, recreational use, and all other lawful purposes, and such rights shall not be denied or infringed by the state or any subdivision thereof," end of quote. Bills at the federal level can be in direct violation of these protections in the Nebraska Constitution, which the citizens felt must be included in the Bill of Rights. The people of Nebraska depend on us to uphold and protect their constitutional rights, which is why LB 194 is necessary. LB 194 prohibits any agent or employee of the state of Nebraska or any political subdivision from participating in the enforcement of any federal directive regarding a firearm, firearm accessory, or ammunition that does not exist under state law. And that's important. I'm going to reemphasize that. That does not exist under state law. LB 194 would protect lawful gun owners in the state of Nebraska from federal government overreach, which seeks to restrict their Second Amendment freedoms. Subsections 4 and 5 of Section 2 of this bill include something very important to emphasize, and I quote, "This right to be free from the commandeering hand of the federal government has been notably recognized by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1997 in Prince versus the United States, when the court held that the federal government may neither issue directives requiring the state to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. And the anti-commandeering principles recognized by the Supreme Court of the United States in Prince versus the United States are consonant with the advice of James Madison, who, in Federalist Number 46, advised a, quote, "refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union in response to either unconstitutional federal measures or constitutional but unpopular federal measures." The bill would not prohibit the State Patrol, for example, from continuing their implementation of the National Instant Criminal Background Check system, the NICS, and the issuance of concealed carry permits. The federal guidelines incorporated into statute are covered on page 3, line 3 of the bill, where we expressly state that this bill only applies to regulations that do not exist under the law of the state of Nebraska. Other states have implemented this legislation without the loss of federal funds, and I'm willing to work with the State Patrol to ensure that that is the case for us as well. At this time, 14 other states have passed legislation making them a Second Amendment sanctuary state, and it is time for Nebraska to be included. Perhaps your office, like mine, has received many emails and phone calls in regard to LB 194. I urge you to also look through 174 public comments total, and of those, I think it was 93 for and 81 opposed. People in Nebraska are adamantly and overwhelmingly opposed to legislation that would restrict their Second Amendment rights and have shown strong support for LB 194. Those who will testify after me will speak to the need of this legislation and the will of the people of Nebraska to see this enacted into law. In the meantime, I will be happy to answer any of your questions.
All right, thank you, Senator Halloran. Questions on LB 194? All right. Oh, Senator Rabel.
Senator Halloran, thank you again for being here and introducing interesting legislation. Were you aware that the state of Missouri passed something similar to this, the Second Amendment Preservation Act last year?
I am aware of that.
Are you also aware that that piece of legislation was objected to by 60 police chiefs throughout the state of Missouri, and it is now held up in court?
I am aware of that as well.
Okay, terrific, thank you.
Terrific.
We're gone.
Thank you, Senator Brewer, and you've had a very busy morning, Senator Halloran. So
That's
yes, I agree with Senator Rabel. Thank you for bringing forward such interesting and complex bills that I think really touch on so many different areas of our work together, and it's definitely invigorating intellectually to engage with you on these matters. But the way I read this, and help me understand if I'm oversimplifying it, is this essentially acts kind of like a nullification kind of measure where and for different reasons over the course of our history, different groups have utilized nullification for laws that they find to be unjust. And I think there's a lot of really interesting history there. But is that essentially what this measure is essentially kind of a nullification measure, or is it not? Is that an unfair assessment?
Well, I would not say anything you would suggest is unfair. But
all right, good to know.
I can understand the concept or the concern about nullification or interposition. I can understand those concerns.
Right.
It's not nullification in this case because we're recognizing the federal government's ability to make those laws and enforce those laws.
Mm-hmm.
What this bill does is does not require our state law enforcement to enforce a federal law. And I think we have Supreme Court rulings that back that up. And back to Senator Rabel's question about Missouri, I think Missouri did how would you say, a relatively incompetent job in their legislation. I think this bill deals with any law that the federal government may have that is not parallel. It does not have a parallel law in the state of Nebraska, right? As I mentioned before. There has to be an existing law in the state of Nebraska that parallels that federal law. If that federal law's got a state law parallels it, we'll enforce it like any other. But if the state has not ruled a law parallel to that infringes upon the Second Amendment, wouldn't be required to enforce it. I hope they're not coming in here. Yes, I'm sorry.
Senator Halloran, I have another question. So when the federal government passed the assault weapons ban, and I think, was it in 1994, did the state of Nebraska adopt that as well?
Well, I'm getting a negative shake of the head from our legal counsel here, so I would say no.
Okay, so again, so that if the federal government reissued an assault weapons ban, you're saying that, and I'm looking at our counsel here too, would say that that would not necessarily impact our state of Nebraska? Or
well, can the chair recognize the?
I can have the legal counsel advise us because that's what he gets paid to do.
So Senator, the federal government has the authority to pass laws at the federal level, and they would be able to enforce the laws that they pass on assault weapons ban or any other topic until a court restrained them. This would just prevent agents of the state or its political subdivisions from participating. So this doesn't direct them to interfere, but it would direct them not to participate in that federal action. The federal government, of course, there's a supremacy clause in the United States Constitution. They would not be fettered by our state law in this respect, but the state wouldn't be involved in assisting.
then to get to my question then, would this create tremendous amount of confusion in law enforcement mind on what federal laws they can and cannot be directed to enforce? Because from summaries about the state of Missouri, they're struggling with that confusion itself.
I think there might be some initial confusion, but I think when if the feds implement a law that has questionable constitutional grounds in regard to the Second Amendment, that would be addressed rather quickly by the state, whether or not that coincides with the state law that we have. If it doesn't coincide with the state law that we have, then we would not be required to enforce it. Now, it would nullify the law, the federal law. The federal government can come in and enforce that law with their own agents, but we wouldn't be required to do it with our state law enforcement. Mm-hmm.
Senator Halloran, I was quickly looking through all of the opponents, trying to find police chiefs, sheriffs, and to this point here, I haven't found any yet. Have you had any communications with law enforcement?
I have. It was just yesterday. We had law enforcement representatives from Lancaster County and Douglas County come in and visit with me about that. And they had reservations about that, much of what you're talking about. And I put it upon their lobbyists to help with a potential amendment to deal with that. So there may be a future amendment coming down the pike here on this, but I have not received it. It was only yesterday that they expressed concern about it.
Well, and I guess if that's where you're hearing from, I mean, if we use LB 77 as an example, the sheriffs came in neutral, the chiefs came in neutral, the police officers came in neutral. It was only the Omaha and Lincoln police unions that came in opposition to 77. So, I mean, that's probably going to be the squeaky wheel if there's a particular law enforcement organization that's going to have the most immediate issue. But I just wanted to, I would have thought that if there was an issue that there would have sent some type of opposition letter or something, but.
And it would have been nice. It's not a secret. It's been several weeks since we dropped bills. I would have, maybe I should have reached out to them, and that's on me, but I would have thought if they had concern, they would have come to me with it, and we would have worked with them on it.
All right. Questions for Senator Halloran? All right. Thank you. Okay. LB 194. Those in support of LB 194 will be up first. Proponents. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Thanks, Senator. Thanks, Senator. Thanks, Chairman. Thanks, Senators, for allowing me this chance to testify. We all know that, or my name's Dave Kendall, Davekendle. We all know the Second Amendment states that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but that hasn't stopped our federal government from attempting to do exactly that. I believe LB 194 clearly represents the will of the people of the state of Nebraska, the second house of this legislature, for several reasons. First, in 1988, the people voted to amend the state constitution with the language that Senator Halloran already read, so I won't read it to you again. Second, in 2021, in a purely grassroots effort, 91 of 93 counties in Nebraska adopted resolutions declaring themselves to be Second Amendment sanctuaries. I participated in that effort in Seward County, and I can tell you that the sheriff in Seward County was one of the main proponents of that law. These counties directed their sheriffs to support their citizens' Second Amendment rights against any federal attempt to infringe upon them. And thirdly, former Governor Pete Ricketts on April 14th, 2021, in recognition of that grassroots statewide effort, declared Nebraska a Second Amendment sanctuary state and signed a proclamation stating, Nebraska shall stand up against federal overreach and attempts to regulate gun ownership and use in the good life. This bill codifies the spirit of these efforts into a single state law, and I urge the committee to advance LB 194 to the floor for a vote of the full legislature. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Questions? All right, thanks for your testimony. We are continuing with proponents to LB 194. Okay. No proponents. We will shift to opponents to LB 194. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you, Senator Brewer. Thank you, members of the committee. My name is Matt Franken. I'm the Vice President of the Lincoln Police Union, and I'm currently assigned detective to the Lincoln Police Unit's Team 3 Criminal Investigative Unit. I've been a police officer almost just over 25 years. And today I'm here to represent the brave men and women of the Lincoln Police Union. What I've given to you is a letter authored by Lincoln Police Chief Teresa Ewens, and she has asked, or members of her staff have asked that I pass that along to you while I'm here. And if you'd allow me to read from a prepared statement, the Lincoln Police Union would like to express our opposition to LB 194. The Lincoln Police Union would like to stress their support of the Constitution and the Second Amendment. We believe LB 194 in its current construct would have unintended consequences, the result of which would negatively impact community safety, more specifically gun violence. We had the opportunity to meet and discuss our concerns with Senator Halloran yesterday. At this point, it doesn't seem like we have the ability to offer any language change suggestions. The partnership between local law enforcement and varying federal law enforcement agencies is extremely beneficial to the local agencies for a number of reasons. Partnership brings with it a number of valuable resources to our local communities that are many times restricted from local funding sources. This gives our local communities added resources that are used to create a safe community to live, work, and raise our families. Please let me explain a few of these resources our community here in Lincoln currently benefits from. Our officers have had access to federal prosecutors who have partnered with us on a variety of cases. Guns and drugs go together hand in hand. Guns and gang violence are and always will be intertwined. Guns are sometimes presented in cases of human trafficking. With the assistance of local federal prosecutors in Lincoln and Omaha, offices of the Lincoln Police Department has successfully partnered on cases like those listed above. The current workload of the Lancaster County Attorney's Office, Douglas County Attorney's Office, and State Attorney General's Office are immense and following a backlog from the pandemic. Having a federal avenue for prosecution gives every prosecutor in the previously listed offices an opportunity to focus more of their energy on the current and future backlog. Jurisdiction can become a limiting factor in some of our more complex cases. Take, for example, a murder investigation that the Lincoln Police Department undertook in 2017. This case was quickly complicated by jurisdiction because evidence led Lincoln police investigators outside of their jurisdiction and outside of the city of Lincoln. Because of a positive relationship with the Nebraska State Patrol, the FBI, the Saline County Sheriff's Offices, and many other state, local, and federal agencies, this issue was resolved quickly and efficiently, and resulted in a positive outcome for the prosecution of those responsible for murdering a young Lincoln woman. A second example occurred in 2018. The Lincoln Police Department investigated a murder of a young mother in North Lincoln home as a result of gun violence. The federal prosecutor in that case charged the defendants under the Hobbs Act. The Hobbs Act prohibits actual or attempted robbery or extortion affecting interstate or foreign commerce in any way or any degree. The collaboration of local law enforcement and federal prosecutors resulted in a successful federal prosecution and conviction of a very violent group and a very positive outcome for a Lincoln family who suffered because of the gun violence. It goes without saying that being responsible with the funding of our budget with local taxpayer dollars is a priority for us. Many of the partnerships provide funding for overtime and training reimbursement. This funding allows our local law enforcement agencies the benefit of keeping officers working cases and out in the community longer, especially during time of low staffing and a challenging recruiting and retention environment like we have never seen in the history of law enforcement. I'd also add that there are many other task forces in Grand Island and Hastings that are doing the same work that we are here, and also out further western Nebraska that are doing the same work with the same federal task forces. Please take this argument against moving LB 194 forward in the spirit that it was intended, and the Lincoln Police Union strongly opposes LB 194. Thank you for your time today.
All right, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Brewer.
Now, unless I've misread what Senator Halloran has put into this bill, you understand this will not restrict you from working with any of the federal agencies, only if there was legislation passed that was contrary to Nebraska law.
I understand that to a certain degree, but there are interpretations among some of our members that believe other than that. Yes, sir. I do understand that.
Well, I don't doubt that there's members you got that might perceive it any way they want, but if it's in black and white in the law, I guess who's going to make the decision that you aren't from the police perspective? Either it's in the law or it's not in the law. And I guess I'm kind of trying to understand this.
Okay. What's your question, sir?
Okay. The federal government passes a law that is not a law in Nebraska. The idea is that Nebraska law enforcement would not be required to then help the feds when they come to kick in a door. So how would that prevent you from working with task forces and doing the things you're doing right now?
I think in the current construct of that particular bill, our interpretation of how that bill is written is that if it is enacted in its current form, that that would eliminate our participation. And I think that's how our chief has interpreted based on the little bit of reading that I did there too.
All right, I will look forward to a legal review on that one. Thank you. Questions? Senator Rabel.
Well, I don't have an exact question, but I think it's an answer to your question that you were asking. A DOJ court filing shows that nearly a quarter of state and local enforcement officials who work directly with ATF, 12 of 53 officers withdrew from joint collaborations before the law even went officially into effect in Missouri. And the recent ATF special agent testified that 13 and perhaps 14 of the 53 state and local officers with federal deputizations have withdrawn from participation in ATF task force in some capacity based on the law that was passed and that now is being held up in court and sued by.
So you're reading about a Missouri law
It's the
that
Missouri
we're
law.
going to use to judge the Nebraska law.
No, they talked about 13 or 14 of the 53 state and local officers in other states that this has been passed in, have made that decision that they have to withdraw from the ATF joint task
Okay.
force.
But I guess this document you're reading, what is this?
Policy sheet on the LB that we're discussing.
Okay.
Fact
And-
find, we have our legislative aides, they have to do their job, give us summaries of, so we have better understand the issue that's brought before us.
Okay, I don't have that sheet, so.
I can.
All right, additional
take your-
questions? So,
I just have a very simple one. I think I missed it. Could you spell and say your name again?
My name is Matthew. Last name is Franken, Franken, and I'm with the Lincoln Police Union. I'm a vice president, and I'm also a detective for the Lincoln Police Department.
all right. Thank you for catching that, John. Appreciate it.
Sorry.
Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Brewer.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you. May I talk?
Sure.
Just before we begin, the handout that's being given to you is actually from Douglas County Sheriff Aaron Hansen. I actually represent the Omaha Police Department, but want to make sure that that was given to you, or he asked me to make sure it was given to the senators.
We'll need your name and spelling to get.
Sure. My name is Sergeant Michael Todd Kozeliski. It's Kozeliki.
Whenever you're ready, I'm sorry.
Okay. So, good morning to everyone. Thank you, Senator Brewer, and the members of the committee for having me. My name is Sergeant Todd Kozeliski with the Omaha Police Department. I've been a police officer for nearly 28 years, and I'm currently assigned to the Omaha Police Department's Firearms Squad. I'd like to take a couple minutes to explain why the Omaha Police Department is in opposition to proposed legislative bill 194. The way in which the bill is written leaves more questions than answers for local law enforcement and our federal partners. The Omaha Police Department, like many other local law enforcement agencies, have traditionally partnered with federal agencies such as the FBI, ATF, U.S. Marshal Service, and the DEA to form task forces that address a variety of community safety and quality of life issues that don't just stop at the city and county lines. These task forces often focus on things such as violent crimes, gangs, human trafficking, sex trafficking, narcotics such as fentanyl, and bank robberies, all of which are more often than not accompanied by firearms. I want to highlight some of the consequences that legislative bill 194 would specifically have in the Omaha Police Department and our violent crime reduction strategies if this bill were to pass. One, it would dissolve many of our task forces, or potentially dissolve many of our task forces, thus preventing agents and OPD detectives from being able to work together on federal firearms related cases. Dissolving the task forces would also mean that OPD would no longer have immediate use of the computerized federal E-Trace system, which is a system used to trace firearms in straw purchase cases and other high-profile investigations. This system often provides immediate investigative leads to our detectives as they conduct their investigations into crimes of violence where a firearm is recovered. Two quick examples. One, in 2015, there was a murder of the Omaha Police Detective Kerry Roscoe. At that time, Omaha police officers provided firearm and other investigative information to the ATF regarding the firearm used to kill Detective Orozco. That information, along with an emergency gun trace, led to the identification of the straw purchaser responsible for providing the firearm to the individual who killed Detective Orozco. Straw purchasers put firearms in the hands of convicted felons, prohibited gang members, and juveniles every year. However, that is a federal gun law violation. LB 194 would prohibit our police employees from sharing this information, assisting in the identification, or participating in the arrest of straw purchasers like the one who provided the firearm that killed Detective Orozco. Again, another quick example. Just 2 days ago, we had an active shooter incident that occurred in an Omaha Target store. OPD provided information to the ATF for an emergency trace on that firearm. Within a couple hours, investigative leads were returned by the ATF for OPD to follow up on relating to that investigation. To continue, discontinued use of the federal NIBIN system. So what NIBIN means is National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. NIBIN conducts comparisons on recovered firearms, bullets, and casings. Those comparisons are then entered into a database for comparison against other crimes across the country. Weekly, shell casings and guns recovered in Omaha have been linked to other crimes within our city and across the country using NIBIN. This has led to the identification and arrest of numerous violent offenders on state and federal crimes such as the homicide, bank robbery, and RICO violations. If this program did not exist, this would certainly have a negative effect on various criminal investigations within the area. To continue, firearm violations on the federal side are much more expanded than that of the state prohibited charge. So on our side, for the state, we have 28-1206, which is the possession of the deadly weapon by a prohibited person. On the federal side, they have basically a prohibited person charge that is expanded as compared to ours. For example, on the federal side, prosecutors have the ability to charge people who are prohibited persons in possession of ammunition, those individuals who possess firearms who are drug users or drug addicts, illegal aliens in possession of firearms, persons who are adjudicated mental defective or committed to a mental institution who possess firearms, and those persons who are also dishonorably discharged from the military and possess firearms. Also, felony defendants who are under indictment or bound over on felony charges, they are prohibited from acquiring new firearms. The Nebraska prohibited charge does not include these options. Thus, LB 194 is written, local law enforcement would not be able to assist in pursuing these types of cases on the federal level. Finally, LB 194 would have a huge impact on the budget of many police departments, including OPD. For many local agencies, participating in these federal task forces comes with funding for things such as officer training, vehicles, and the fuel that fill those vehicles, officer safety, investigative equipment.
Go ahead, finish up.
Investigative expenses such as local law agencies do not have the budget to conduct long-term expensive investigations involving drugs like fentanyl, which are often distributed by criminals who utilize firearms and are linked to out-of-state organized violent crime rings. Grant funding could also be affected by this. Traditionally, many of the violent crime and/or intervention and prevention federal grant programs that OPD receives require us to partner with federal law enforcement and prosecutorial partners. LB 194 would essentially eliminate the eligibility for many of these grant programs should we no longer be allowed to assist or cooperate with our federal partners relating to federal firearms violations. Many of our investigations, it's initially unknown whether or not a case will develop into one that includes federal firearms violations. When cases do develop into those partnering with federal law enforcement agencies and prosecutors, it's crucial that we work together on these. Due to the vagueness of the proposed law and out of the fear of fine or prosecution, local law enforcement agencies will have to be extremely restrictive on how we conduct business with our federal partners as it pertains to any investigations involving firearms. Whether the intent of this proposed law or not, LB 194 muddies the partnership between local law enforcement and federal law enforcement agencies as it appears to protect criminals more than assist law enforcement from protecting our law-abiding citizens. Essentially, LB 194 handcuffs the cooperation between local and federal law enforcement more than it handcuffs the criminals who are out there committing violent crimes. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, questions? All right, let me jump into this. All right, go ahead, Senator Rabel.
I'm sorry, this is not a question, but I want to say thank you for the Omaha Police Department. Their incredibly quick action yesterday at the Target. I mean, it makes all Nebraskans proud of your response and the officers immediately taking care of that situation where there was no loss of life except the individual who was perpetrating the crime. So
Thank you, sir.
All right, back to the bill. The Second Amendment Preservation Act was not, and we'll confirm that when Senator Holler gets here, but the idea is not that you instantly sever all ties with any federal agencies. And yet that's a testimony you're giving here, that immediately these task forces are shattered and that all this nightmare of things are going to happen. The idea simply is, as I understand it, that if there was a federal law that was implemented, that there either is not a law here or against a law in Nebraska, that's the only time this would even come into effect. I mean, is that how you perceive this, or have I read it all wrong here?
No, well, so I think it's vague, Senator. I really do, because I go back to Senator, is it Raybold? Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes.
So I go back to what she's talking about relating to Missouri. I know probably the laws aren't exactly the same, but here's the issue. It sounds like that's going on in Missouri. You have, I'm part of the ATF task force down in Omaha, up in Omaha. And you have several detectives who were part of these task forces in Missouri who actually were pulled from these task forces because they were unsure whether or not, whether it be unsure or vagueness or what have you, of whether or not to pursue these federal firearms laws that are not included in some of their state laws, which I kind of spell out here. Some of these firearms laws that we deal with on a normal basis are not included in the in the state side for us. So the thing would be is that, okay, so if we're going to sit there and say, well, this is not intended to affect that. Well, it does. I mean, our prohibited side for the state is not the same as the federal one. Yeah. I mean, the commonalities would be, a prohibited person, when it comes to being a felon. But I mean, if you expand that to the ammunition, if you expand that to the mental defective side of it, if you expand that to the illegal alien side of it, we need our federal partners to be able to enforce those types of laws. We need their assistance in that. The straw purchasing, that's a perfect example where we use that, especially in my unit, all the time. ATF tracing, we use that all the time. And when speaking with, the ATF, is the potential there that if a law was passed like this, that those systems would not be available because we're sharing of the information that could lead to federal firearms violations, which then goes on the federal side. Yeah, there's an issue at that point. I mean, there's an issue in the sense that, are we going to be liable for that? And I think that's where people are uneasy is the liability side of it.
Well, no, and if I was in law enforcement, I would be concerned too. And I think that's a fair issue. And Sheriff Hansen's letter here, he has a specific line and an issue to these addressed. So,
and I'm sorry, I don't have a copy.
Well,
of that. You guys got all the copies, so
well, it's not fair if you don't have one in front of you.
That's okay.
The point being that there probably needs to be a look at things that are in conflict that does put you in a bad way. So that I totally agree with that. I think we need to sort that out. I guess what I'm trying to sort through is when we have these, especially Second Amendment issues, when we call across the state to talk to the other sheriffs across the state, because ultimately the sheriff is the senior law enforcement guy in each of the counties, it comes down to two counties that are always our issue. Now that's where most of the population is, so rightfully so. You guys deal with more, difficulties, more challenges, more volume, everything. So what we try to figure out is how can we help those that don't have that and yet not hurt you? So that's what we're trying to work through here. So please don't perceive this as trying to do something to hurt you guys. If it's something that's going to hurt you guys, we need to figure out how to make it so that it isn't.
Right. And from our side, I mean, speaking with, again, being part of the ATF task force, I mean, you have the potential of, let's just say this bill is passed the way it's written. Let's just say that. Okay. So like Omaha itself, I mean, Omaha has the only NIBIN system in this state. Okay. The reason why our system is so successful, not only in the Midwest, but in the United States, I mean, we probably have one of the higher hit ratios relating to NIBIN. And that's where you're, again, doing the comparisons between shell casings and fire and guns and being able to connect crimes or whatever, is because we have dedicated personnel down in our crime lab who are basically test firing all these firearms. I mean, we take in almost 1,500 firearms this year. And so those semi-automatics that are taken in are all test fired. The shell casings that are collected from all these scenes are all entered in the NIBIN, and then we're able to make those correlations. We work with the Correlation Center through the ATF. When you speak to the ATF side on this, is there a potential of losing a system like that? Absolutely. And I mean, that's where, and then again, going back to the gun tracing, absolutely, because that is all through the federal government. I mean, they control that entire thing. So the potential of not being able to use those systems to further our cases when it comes to potentially going into federal firearms laws. I get what you're saying when you say, well, the existing federal firearms laws, you're okay. Meaning if they're the same as the state.
Right.
The problem is there are laws that are not the same as the state. Straw purchasing being one, and again, the ones that I talked about relating to the prohibited person, that we do a lot of that in the city of Omaha. So that becomes an issue at that point.
Well, you guys have the hardest job because you're trying to not only deal with the criminal element, but you have plenty of lawyers that are looking over your shoulder trying to judge what you've done in an instantaneous decision that may or may not determine whether you live or die. So I don't know of anyone who has to do that. In the military, we have plenty of time to plan it, organize it, go do it, and then it's usually we go in and do it and we go do something else.
And I appreciate
you guys
you
are under the
recognizing
gun 24/7. So never doubt for a minute how much we appreciate what you do and the fact that you guys put it on the line every day. So other questions? Senator Lowe.
That's all right. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for coming to testify.
Absolutely.
Today. If the feds put in a law where it places a weapons ban or an ammunition ban on the citizens of America, and it's infringing on our Second Amendment rights, in your opinion, or the department's opinion, I know you're not speaking for everybody in the department, but you're here on Sheriff Hanson's behest. How would our legislature deal with that to protect?
How would they deal with that?
How would they deal with that to protect our Nebraskan Second Amendment rights?
That's a really hard question, Senator. And I'm sorry, I don't know if I can answer that. I just want to make sure that
we're just trying to be proactive.
No, I understand that. I want to make sure it's understood that with the Omaha Police Department, we're not all about like a gun grab type situation. And I think what happens with these types of laws, though the intent is not to hurt law enforcement, obviously, but you have these unintended consequences on these types of laws that people do not think about. They're not seeing the big picture. So we're not all about the gun grab stuff is what I'm saying. So we're not out there just, I can't ever see a situation where you're just going to start going door to door and just start picking off firearms because the federal government has some type of a law relating to that. I think that would be ludicrous.
There have been countries that have done that.
Yeah. And I think my personal opinion is that that's wrong. I think that's because I am pro Second Amendment too, within reason, obviously, in the sense that if it's going to affect the police department, which I think it will, just like it did in some agencies down in Missouri, then that's a real issue because, a task force like the one that I'm on and also the FBI, DEA, and marshals are a little bit different, but you're going after the most violent offenders, when it comes to creating the most havoc that's in your city. And if we're hamstrung on that because we cannot go after certain laws or what have you, because it looks like we're participating with the feds, that's a big issue because it's going to create a lot of issues for all these communities, not just our community. I can't speak for everybody, but down in Lincoln, I'm sure, Grand Island, all these larger communities are going to have issues relating to that because there's crime all over the place, So, going back to what you asked, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Of course, that's why you guys are the senators and there's lobbyists and what have you to try to figure that out. I don't know. I just want to make sure it's understood that the Omaha Police Department's not all about the gun grab. That's not. We understand. I get an idea of why people want to pass this because they want to protect the Second Amendment, and I'm all for that. But, let's make some common sense legislation here to where it's not going to hamstring any of the law enforcement when it comes to being able to work with the federal system on a normal basis on these laws that we're going after that I spoke about. So hopefully I answered it the best I can.
Can you help us in that legislation? So that we
Can I personally help you, or?
Well,
I don't know about me. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, sir. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I was asked yesterday to represent this because I work for the firearms squad and what have you. I don't know the answer to that until I talk with people obviously connected to our department and the unions and what have you. So, and the lobbyists, I guess. So I really don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry I can't answer. So
thank you.
Yep, no
Thank you
problem.
for what you do.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'm absolutely confident that one called Aaron Hansen, he would be here to help line up issues and understand things.
Well, and I think he, I do have the letter here, but I mean, I think he expressed that in that letter that, that he also understands that the intent of the bill, but, that there could be some consequences here that you guys, when I say you guys, I'm talking about,
he's always been great when he worked with you guys.
Yes.
Where he's at now.
Yep.
He's never hesitated to help in any way he could. So, all right. Any other questions? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Come on. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you. My name is Melody Vaccaro, Melody Vaccaro. I am here representing Nebraska Kids Against Gun Violence. We are opposed to LB 194. There are a lot of different ways people can look at a bill that wants to remove partnerships with the federal government. I really wanted to talk today about and really bring home a national conversation and a state conversation that we're having, which is where is the line around police accountability? And thinking about, we already have problems where we're not always seeing law enforcement enforce our state laws, and adding some confusion to the mix about whether or not we enforce some federal laws, some state, who gets to decide that? And I think that's a big problem. So I've brought a handout that shows some progression. In 2020, Nebraskans Against Gun Violence released the Nebraska Firearm Report. And we found that a lot of law enforcement agencies around the state are not reporting their domestic violence information to the State Crime Commission, which is in violation of Statute 42-930. It was passed in 1998. So long time passed. Aaliyah Connolly did a whole investigative report for the Omaha World Herald in 2021. Senator Wendy DeBoer from Omaha brought a legislative resolution to study this issue. And you can see that, when you look at the 2016 noncompliance, you look at 2021, there's a lot fewer departments. So some of that work has been good. We still see Omaha Police Department out of compliance. And then, which, Megan Hunt, Senator Hunt is part of that. And then you, Senator Tom Brewer, are part of, in your district is the Loop County Sheriff's Office is not reporting their data. And so I wanted to really raise that topic of police accountability. And one of the things that they are accountable to is, enforcing and following all of the laws that we have in our society. And I have to bring up, of course, just this week, the family of Tyree Nichols buried him because he was murdered by police during a traffic stop. Right? Like, we're in a big national conversation around that. And so it is I don't think the direction of the conversation is not about like, oh, we're going to ban guns. That's not the direction of a national conversation. We heard that throughout the Obama term. We're hearing it through the Biden term. And there's nothing really actually, this is all just, like national theater that's happening in these political rhetoric circles. It's not really a real conversation on the table that we need to like prepare and protect ourselves from. We actually really do have a problem with police and society and knowing, do they have the right tools? Do they have the right accountability systems? Do we have the right structures in place to make sure that we are living in harmony between the arm of government that is the enforcer of the laws, and then of course the right of people to live in peace and live in safety. And that includes in partnership with police, and that includes from police violence. And so, you know, that's something that I wanted to bring up. And, you know, so we're a nation of laws. We expect everybody to follow the laws. That includes people that are like me, just regular citizens, living our best lives. That includes law enforcement, like we've been discussing. And, you know, of course, it includes policymakers. We expect them to follow the laws. We live in a representative democracy, and we expect people to be represented in every district by people who live in their districts. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Questions? All right, since you brought it up, I'm gonna have to fire back on this issue. And I cannot speak for the Omaha Police Department, even though they're on here. I will tell you that the one you've got me on the bad list here is Luke County, just as a reference. County seat is in Taylor, Nebraska, with a population of 600. They got 600 square miles and they have a sheriff, one person. So I don't doubt that they probably missed the report, but we work hard at finding additional requirements for law enforcement that make it almost impossible for them to meet the training to provide any type of protection because of just being available. And in these smaller counties, they're ragged. They just got nothing left. So I don't doubt that we're legitimately missing the report, but I don't think it's because they're bad. And you know, I struggle with the fact that we talk about what happened in Memphis, and yet we just heard we couldn't be prouder of the Omaha Police Department when they did. So let's not mix them, because I think sometimes we make a particular group bad because of what others do. In Omaha, I don't know how we can be any more pleased with how they've helped when they needed it, and because they've had some really tough situations in the last few weeks, and I don't know any of them that they haven't really worked hard to try and do a good job and respond as needed and be there. And so I think this is probably correct, and we're probably guilty of it, but I just struggle when I got a sheriff and that's it. He tries his best.
Yeah, there actually in the Nebraska Crime Commission are lots. I mean, every sheriff and county and police department, they're all listed in the Crime Commission report, and many of them do report 0 or 1 incident for like the entirety of the year, right? Because of the low population numbers. And so of course the most egregious violation is Omaha, where almost half the state lives. And you know, so of course that is certainly, I understand that. And I also agree, we count on police to do the right thing. And what I was really trying to bring to light is this dissonance between what we're seeing around guns in the politic and what we're seeing around guns in the real world. Because in the real world, people bring assault weapons and the Omaha police show up and they kill you because you are dangerous and you are putting everyone in danger when you do that. But meanwhile, when we're talking in the politic, we act like it's not a big deal that people with assault weapons show up to show how angry they are and how they could kill everybody in a moment. And we're all supposed to be like, oh yeah, that's fine though. But at Target, it's a worth killing someone over. That is a dissonance that I'm trying to bring up. And so as we're talking about the role of police, I think that is, you know, that's just part of that dissonance.
All right, thank you. Okay. Additional opponents to LB 194. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you, Senators. I'm Sherry St. Clair, SHERI-ST-CLAIR, speaking once again on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. We are in opposition to LB 194. The League believes efficient and economical government requires coordination among different agencies and levels of government. It looks like the purpose of this bill is to provide for a possible future scenario in which Nebraska law could conflict with federal law. While there are instances where federal law changes and it takes time for state laws to catch up, intentionally creating laws for the purpose of conflicting with federal ones is not in the best interest of Nebraska. Taxpayers of our state trust unicameral will appropriate funds for the general good, not needless lawsuits. Section 7 of this bill states that if any portion of the bill is found unconstitutional, the remaining section should still be considered valid, indicating that even in writing this bill, there's an anticipation of court challenges. So again, fruitless and expensive court battles don't serve the needs of our communities. The bill also states that any public employee who knowingly violates this act, or in other words, follows federal law, would be subject to civil penalties that include fines up to $3,000, collected as lien foreclosures if not paid in cash, Class 1 misdemeanors. So not only does this bill open up Nebraska to frivolous lawsuits, it would also place public employees in a somewhat precarious position. Public employees may have to choose between following conflicting sets of orders at the perils of their jobs, financial stability, and legal standings. So attempts to intentionally put the state employees against the federal government cannot be recommended. The League discourages this bill's future further advancement. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Question for Sharon. All right, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator.
All right, any additional opponents to LB 194? Anybody in the neutral? Senator Holler, would you like to close on LB 194? Went a little longer than I thought.
Well, it did. That's good. That's the way it works. That's the way it should work. It's fine. Thank God for Google. I had a little time to do a little Googling. And we all do that, so don't look at me with skepticism and cynicism. But the Missouri law, the distinction between what the Missouri law has in place and what I'm proposing here is nullification. Missouri law very specifically nullifies a federal law, and this bill does not do that. If there's, it comes into play if the federal law proposes some kind of restriction on the Second Amendment that is not defined in our laws. Missouri doesn't do that. They just cut the wide swath and nullify federal law. So it's not comparing apples to apples with their bill and what's happening there and what's happening here. Now, that being said, we all say when there is opposition to any of our sponsored bills, well, I'd be glad to work with the opposition. Okay, and that's what I will do. I don't get paid near as much as their lobbyist does, so I'm not expecting anything from her monetarily, but at some level, it's on them. If they have issues with the bill, I would suspect that they should be helping me out with that bill, and I will contact them and see if we can do that.
I will be sure to get you a copy. Did you get a copy of Aaron Hansen's letter?
Don't think I might have, but I was kind of busy
Okay,
Googling.
well, we need to get you a copy. There's one example he has in here, and maybe you and Dick could look at it and legally think through whether or not we're going to make an issue that's going to cause him challenges. Senator Rabel.
Senator Heller, were you done? I did want to.
No, yes, that's fine.
So one of the things that I wanted to point out from the testimony of OPD and LPD, that they talk about compliance and putting in jeopardy, like the Crime Commission grants are so important, I know, to the city of Lincoln. When we get additional funding to hire more police officers or allow us to purchase additional safety gear for law enforcement or firearms or training, it goes that whole gambit. And so when we're in non-compliance, that's what they talked about, that we put at risk some of those federal dollars that are desperately needed to help supplement the city and the county dollars to keep law enforcement safe and to allow them to do their jobs as efficiently and as possible. So I'm hoping that when you reach out to them to enlist their help, also follow up on the compliance issue, like what do we put at risk? I know they mentioned a few items about that, but we're so intertwined with the federal government. And to be honest, we're dependent upon this partnership to allow our law enforcement to do their jobs as efficiently and effectively and as safely as possible and to keep our community safe. So the compliance and losing those federal dollars are very, very impactful. And so I think Ms. Vaccaro brought up the compliance, only that, and we recognize that there is a tremendous shortage of law enforcement trying to do their job with whatever resources they do have. But it also puts at risk those counties and those communities of federal funding when they're not in compliance in reporting these crime statistics that they have to do on a regular and routine basis. That's just one example of all the many things that they have to do in regards to keeping in compliance so that they can still continue to get federal funds. That was my
That was a question?
No, I kind of rambled, so I apologize, but
No, that's
I just wanted, the question was to you, could you work with them as you're going to follow up with them, talk about compliance issues and what do we put at risk?
I understand.
What's in jeopardy?
It's-
Because that's
it's-
important.
I appreciate that. At some level, this conjures back to some discussion in the first two bills that I had in reference to, for lack of a better term, the heavy hand of the federal government in forcing us to do something that may not be of our will at the state level, right? So, yeah, we'll withhold money. No, we should be focused a little bit more on ATF, for example, saying, no, don't you dare withdraw money from helping us enforce crimes. A homicide is against the law at the federal level. It's against the law at the state level. About every drug law that you can think of is a violation at the federal level, and similarly at the state level. And we're trying to enforce those. We need your help. Please don't pull your money unless you want to be vindictive at the federal level. So, I mean, if they want to leverage their federal money to get us to write or not write laws, I guess that's their prerogative. But I will talk to them about compliance issues.
All right, any additional questions? Seeing none, we'll read in on LB 194. We've got 80 proponents, 72 opponents, 0 in the neutral. With that, we will close the hearing on LB 194 and close the hearings for this morning. See you guys in a little over an hour.